The history of the British Empire is built upon a foundation of granite and gold. Yet the truth of the Tudor line is far more fragile. In the year 1588, as the Spanish Armada approached the coast of England, a different kind of terror was unfolding within the private chambers of Richmond Palace. You have been told that Queen Elizabeth I was the Virgin Queen, a woman of iron will who sacrificed her personal life for her people. This is a profound lie designed to protect a biological horror. The truth is that the Queen was not merely aging. She was transforming. Her body was undergoing a catastrophic alchemical shift that turned her skin into a substance, resembling translucent porcelain and her bones into brittle glass. The layers of white lead makeup she wore were not a sign of vanity, but a structural necessity to keep her physical form from fracturing in public. On the night of April 15th, the illusion failed. A sound echoed through the royal bedchamber that changed history forever. It was the sharp, crystalline snap of a structural failure. The Queen's face had literally cracked under the weight of her own secret. The Church, the Council, and the apothecaries spent centuries burying the evidence of this moral decay. They turned a dying woman into a living statue to maintain the power of the crown. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The world outside is loud and chaotic, but here, in the shadows of the 16th century, time moves slowly. The candles flicker, casting long, dancing shadows against the heavy oak walls. Relax your mind and listen closely to the echoes of a secret that was never meant to be heard. The year is 1588. It is a time of heavy velvet, DMP stone, and the constant rhythmic ticking of early mechanical clocks. Richmond Palace sits like a silent sentry along the Thames, its windows glowing with a soft amber light. Inside, the atmosphere is thick with the smell of lavender and vinegar, a sharp combination used to mask the metallic scent of the heavy lead that the Queen applied to her skin every morning. Elizabeth is alone. At least that is what the official records say. In reality, she is never truly alone. She is a prisoner of her own image. As she sits before her great silver-backed mirror, the only sound is the crackle of the hearth and the distant, muffled sound of the river. She looks into the reflection, but she does not see a woman. She sees a project. For 20 years, her inner circle has been managing a condition that defies natural law. They call it the cirrus translucens. It began with a small patch on her wrist, a spot where the skin became so clear that the blue veins beneath seemed to glow with an unnatural, electric light. Then it spread. By the time the Armada was sighted, her entire upper body had become a mosaic of porcelain-like tissue. To touch her was to risk breaking her. This is why the court developed the most complex protocols in the history of monarchy. No one was allowed to touch the Queen's bare skin. No one was allowed to assist her in dressing without wearing silk-lined gloves. The Virgin Queen was a title used to explain why she could never be held, never be embraced, and never be a mother. Her body could not sustain the weight of life. It was becoming a monument of glass. To understand the depth of this conspiracy, one must look at the logs of the royal apothecary, specifically the shipments of Venetian cirrus. In the late 1580s, the amount of white lead being delivered to Richmond and Whitehall was staggering. It was enough to paint a fleet of ships. Historians have often dismissed this as a sign of Elizabeth's increasing insecurity as she aged. But the psychological reality was much darker. The lid was being used as a filler. As the Queen's skin became thinner and more brittle, the apothecaries developed a paste that acted as a secondary layer of flesh. It was a mixture of ground lead, egg whites, vinegar, and a secret alchemical powder provided by John Dee, the Queen's mysterious advisor and occultist. This paste would dry into a hard, shell-like finish. When you see portraits of Elizabeth from this era, you notice the mask-like quality of her face. This was not an artistic choice by the painters. They were painting what they saw, a woman whose face was a literal reconstruction, but lead is a poison. As it seeped into her system, it began to calcify her bones. The glass bone theory is documented in the private, redacted journals of Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, the Queen's physician. He noted that her movements became stiff and rhythmic. She walked with a slow, deliberate pace, not because of dignity, but because any sudden jar to her frame could cause a fracture. Imagine the psychological toll of this existence. Every step is a gamble. Every smile is a risk. On that fateful night in April, the Queen reached for a heavy silver brush. Her hand, weakened by the internal decay of the bone, trembled. The weight was too much. As she turned her head to call for a servant, the tension in her jaw reached its breaking point. The snap heard by the page outside was the sound of the Cirrus mask cracking, but beneath it, the very bone of her jaw had suffered a stress fracture. The illusion of the eternal, unchanging Queen was shattered in an instant. The aftermath of the Richmond incident reveals the true nature of power. Within minutes of the sound, Lord Burleigh and Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spymaster, were inside the chamber. They did not call for a surgeon in the traditional sense. They called for the artificers. These were men who worked with porcelain and glass, not with flesh and blood. The page who had heard the sound was immediately taken to the Tower of London. He would never see the sun again. His crime was not theft or treason. It was the act of hearing the truth. The Queen was moved to a smaller, inner room where the windows were covered with heavy tapestries. For 3 weeks, the public was told she had a heavy cold. In reality, she was being repaired. The artificers used a new blend of adhesive, a resin brought back from the New World, to fuse the crack in her jaw and the layers of her skin. During this time, the council debated the unthinkable. Should they replace her? There were rumors of a double, a young woman from the countryside who shared the Queen's height and red hair. But a double could not hold the Tudor frequency. John Dee argued that Elizabeth's transformation was a sign of divinity, that she was becoming a celestial being, a creature of pure light and crystal. The council chose to believe him, not out of faith, but out of necessity. If the people knew their queen was breaking apart, the Spanish would be at the gates of London within the month. And so the Porcelain Mandate was enacted. The Queen would never again appear in public without a minimum of 3 inches of clearance between her and any other human being. The distant majesty was born from a biological catastrophe. As the weeks passed, Elizabeth became more of a ghost in her own palace. She stopped eating solid foods, as the act of chewing was now too dangerous for her reinforced jaw. She lived on a diet of strained broths and sweetened wine. The scent of the vinegar and lead in her room became so thick that the servants often fainted from the fumes. But the secret held. The mask was reapplied thicker than ever, and the Queen returned to the throne room, a silent, stiff monument to the power of a lie. We must ask ourselves what it means for a human being to become an object. Elizabeth's letters from this period, those that weren't burned by Walsingham, show a mind that was beginning to detach from reality. She spoke of her body as the vessel or the casket. She understood that she was no longer the occupant of her skin, but a prisoner within it. The Tier 1 audience, those who seek the deeper informative layers of history, must recognize that the golden age of England was funded and maintained by this singular horrific secret. The stability of the nation depended on the physical integrity of a woman who was literally falling apart. The moral decay was not in Elizabeth herself, but in the system that forced her to remain a statue. The Church of England, established by her father, was complicit. They framed her incorruptibility as a gift from God. They told the people that the Queen did not age because she was chosen. In reality, she did not age because she was being embalmed while she was still alive. The lead preserved her, yes, but it also erased her. By late 1588, after the defeat of the Armada, the Queen's transformation reached its final phase. Her skin had reached a level of transparency that could no longer be hidden by simple makeup. She began to wear the great ruff, those massive, stiff collars you see in her portraits. They weren't just fashion. They were structural supports. They held her head in place. They hid the seams where the porcelain skin met the reinforced tissue of her neck. Every time she stood before her people, she was performing an act of incredible physical and psychological endurance. She was a woman of glass standing in a world of iron. The tension of this existence created a hypnotic aura around her. People who met her described a feeling of coldness, a sense that they were standing near something that wasn't quite alive, yet possessed a terrifying static power. In the deep archives of the British Museum, there exists a fragment of a letter written in a shaky, elegant hand. It is believed to be one of the last things Elizabeth wrote before her hands became too stiff to hold a quill. In it, she describes a dream where she is standing in the middle of the ocean and the salt water is slowly turning her to salt. She writes, "I am becoming the mirror. I see everyone, but no one sees me. The history of the British Empire is built upon a foundation of granite and gold, yet the truth of the Tudor line is far more fragile. In the year 1588, as the Spanish Armada approached the coast of England, a different kind of terror was unfolding within the private chambers of Richmond Palace. You have been told that Queen Elizabeth I was the Virgin Queen, a woman of iron will who sacrificed her personal life for her people. This is a profound lie designed to protect a biological horror. The truth is that the Queen was not merely aging, she was transforming. Her body was undergoing a catastrophic alchemical shift that turned her skin into a substance resembling translucent porcelain and her bones into brittle glass. The layers of white lid makeup she wore were not a sign of vanity, but a structural necessity to keep her physical form from fracturing in public. On the night of April 15th, the illusion failed. A sound echoed through the royal bedchamber that changed history forever. It was the sharp, crystalline snap of a structural failure. The Queen's face had literally cracked under the weight of her own secret. The Church, the Council, and the apothecaries spent centuries burying the evidence of this moral decay. They turned a dying woman into a living statue to maintain the power of the crown. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The world outside is loud and chaotic, but here, in the shadows of the 16th century, time moves slowly. The candles flicker, casting long, dancing shadows against the heavy oak walls. Relax your mind and listen closely to the echoes of a secret that was never meant to be heard. The year is 1588. It is a time of heavy velvet, DMP stone, and the constant rhythmic ticking of early mechanical clocks. Richmond Palace sits like a silent sentry along the Thames, its windows glowing with a soft amber light. Inside, the atmosphere is thick with the smell of lavender and vinegar. a sharp combination used to mask the metallic scent of the heavy lead that the Queen applied to her skin every morning. Elizabeth is alone. At least, that is what the official records say. In reality, she is never truly alone. She is a prisoner of her own image. As she sits before her great silver-backed mirror, the only sound is the crackle of the hearth and the distant, muffled sound of the river. She looks into the reflection, but she does not see a woman. She sees a project. For 20 years, her inner circle has been managing a condition that defies natural law. They call it the cirrus translucens. It began with a small patch on her wrist, a spot where the skin became so clear that the blue veins beneath seemed to glow with an unnatural electric light. Then it spread. By the time the Armada was sighted, her entire upper body had become a mosaic of porcelain-like tissue. To touch her was to risk breaking her. This is why the court developed the most complex protocols in the history of monarchy. No one was allowed to touch the Queen's bare skin. No one was allowed to assist her in dressing without wearing silk-lined gloves. The Virgin Queen was a title used to explain why she could never be held, never be embraced, and never be a mother. Her body could not sustain the weight of life. It was becoming a monument of glass. To understand the depth of this conspiracy, one must look at the logs of the royal apothecary, specifically the shipments of Venetian cirrus. In the late 1580s, the amount of white lead being delivered to Richmond and Whitehall was staggering. It was enough to paint a fleet of ships. Historians have often dismissed this as a sign of Elizabeth's increasing insecurity as she aged, but the psychological reality was much darker. The lead was being used as a filler. As the Queen's skin became thinner and more brittle, the apothecaries developed a paste that acted as a secondary layer of flesh. It was a mixture of ground lead, egg whites, vinegar, and a secret alchemical powder provided by John Dee, the Queen's mysterious advisor and occultist. This paste would dry into a hard, shell-like finish. When you see portraits of Elizabeth from this era, you notice the mask-like quality of her face. This was not an artistic choice by the painters. They were painting what they saw, a woman whose face was a literal reconstruction, but lead is a poison. As it seeped into her system, it began to calcify her bones. The glass bone theory is documented in the private redacted journals of Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, the Queen's physician. He noted that her movements became stiff and rhythmic. She walked with a slow, deliberate pace, not because of dignity, but because any sudden jar to her frame could cause a fracture. Imagine the psychological toll of this existence. Every step is a gamble. Every smile is a risk. On that fateful night in April, the Queen reached for a heavy silver brush. Her hand, weakened by the internal decay of the bone, trembled. The weight was too much. As she turned her head to call for a servant, the tension in her jaw reached its breaking point. The snap heard by the page outside was the sound of the cirrus mask cracking, but beneath it, the very bone of her jaw had suffered a stress fracture. The illusion of the eternal, unchanging Queen was shattered in an instant. The aftermath of the Richmond incident reveals the true nature of power. Within minutes of the sound, Lord Burleigh and Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spymaster, were inside the chamber. They did not call for a surgeon in the traditional sense. They called for the artificers. These were men who worked with porcelain and glass, not with flesh and blood. The page who had heard the sound was immediately taken to the Tower of London. He would never see the sun again. His crime was not theft or treason. It was the act of hearing the truth. The Queen was moved to a smaller inner room where the windows were covered with heavy tapestries. For 3 weeks, the public was told she had a heavy cold. In reality, she was being repaired. The artificers used a new blend of adhesive, a resin brought back from the New World, to fuse the crack in her jaw and the layers of her skin. During this time, the council debated the unthinkable. Should they replace her? There were rumors of a double, a young woman from the countryside who shared the Queen's height and red hair. But a double could not hold the Tudor frequency. John Dee argued that Elizabeth's transformation was a sign of divinity, that she was becoming a celestial being, a creature of pure light and crystal. The council chose to believe him, not out of faith, but out of necessity. If the people knew their queen was breaking apart, the Spanish would be at the gates of London within the month. And so the Porcelain Mandate was enacted. The queen would never again appear in public, without a minimum of 3 inches of clearance between her and any other human being. The distant majesty was born from a biological catastrophe. As the weeks passed, Elizabeth became more of a ghost in her own palace. She stopped eating solid foods, as the act of chewing was now too dangerous for her reinforced jaw. She lived on a diet of strained broths and sweetened wine. The scent of the vinegar and lead in her room became so thick that the servants often fainted from the fumes. But the secret held. The mask was reapplied, thicker than ever, and the Queen returned to the throne room, a silent, stiff monument to the power of a lie. We must ask ourselves what it means for a human being to become an object. Elizabeth's letters from this period, those that weren't burned by Walsingham, show a mind that was beginning to detach from reality. She spoke of her body as the vessel or the casket. She understood that she was no longer the occupant of her skin, but a prisoner within it. The Tier 1 audience, those who seek the deeper informative layers of history, must recognize that the golden age of England was funded and maintained by this singular, horrific secret. The stability of the nation depended on the physical integrity of a woman who was literally falling apart. The moral decay was not in Elizabeth herself, but in the system that forced her to remain a statue. The Church of England, established by her father, was complicit. They framed her incorruptibility as a gift from God. They told the people that the Queen did not age because she was chosen. In reality, she did not age because she was being embalmed while she was still alive. The lid preserved her, yes, but it also erased her. By late 1588, after the defeat of the Armada, the Queen's transformation reached its final phase. Her skin had reached a level of transparency that could no longer be hidden by simple makeup. She began to wear the great ruff, those massive, stiff collars you see in her portraits. They weren't just fashion, they were structural supports. They held her head in place. They hid the seams where the porcelain skin met the reinforced tissue of her neck. Every time she stood before her people, she was performing an act of incredible physical and psychological endurance. She was a woman of glass standing in a world of iron. The tension of this existence created a hypnotic aura around her. People who met her described a feeling of coldness, a sense that they were standing near something that wasn't quite alive, yet possessed a terrifying static power. In the deep archives of the British Museum, there exists a fragment of a letter written in a shaky, elegant hand. It is believed to be one of the last things Elizabeth wrote before her hands became too stiff to hold a quill. In it, she describes a dream where she is standing in the middle of the ocean and the salt water is slowly turning her to salt. She writes, "I am becoming the mirror. I see everyone, but no one sees me. They only see the light reflecting off my surface." This is the ultimate tragedy of the Tudor line. The forbidden knowledge that John Dee pursued, the secret of eternal life through alchemy, had been found, but it was a curse. It turned the human soul into a cold, decorative thing. The Queen's bones were now so dense with lead and mineral deposits that she was effectively a living fossil. The psychological layer of this story is the realization that we often prefer a beautiful lie to a disturbing truth. The people of England wanted a queen who would never leave them, a mother who would never die. The council gave them exactly that, a woman who could not die because she had already ceased to be human. The atmospheric build of this era is one of silence and candlelight. Think of the long nights in the palace where the only sound was the Queen's slow, labored breathing, a sound that was metallic and thin, like air passing through a silver flute. Think of the maids who had to apply the ceruse in the morning, their fingers trembling as they touched the cold, hard surface of her cheek. They knew, they all knew. But the weight of the secret was heavier than the weight of the crown. If you were to walk through the halls of Richmond today, you might still feel that archive chill. It is the lingering presence of a woman who was forced to become a diamond to survive a world of coal. But diamonds have flaws. And as we move into the next chapter of this hidden history, we find that the crack in Elizabeth's face was only the beginning. There was a second sound that night, one that the page didn't hear, but one that John Dee recorded in his ciphered diary. As the midnight hour passes and the world outside sinks further into sleep, we must look at the rituals that took place in the Queen's chamber during the months following the incident. These were not the rituals of a court. They were the rituals of a laboratory. Every night after the heavy doors were bolted, the apothecary's shadow would enter. This was a man whose name has been erased from every register. His job was to polish the Queen, because her skin was now producing a fine crystalline dust, a byproduct of the alchemical reaction in her blood. She had to be buffed with soft chamois cloth and expensive oils. If this dust were allowed to accumulate, it would catch the light and make her look as though she were covered in frost. The atmospheric build here is one of extreme, clinical quiet. The only sound in the room was the soft shush of the cloth against the Queen's arm. Elizabeth would sit in a high-backed chair, her eyes fixed on a single candle, entering a state of alchemical trance. In this state, her heart rate would drop to almost nothing. Her body was conserving what little biological energy it had left to maintain its structural integrity. It was during one of these polishing sessions that Dr. Lopez discovered something even more disturbing. As he worked on the Queen's left shoulder, the light of the candle passed directly through the muscle and bone, casting a shadow of her internal skeleton onto the velvet wall behind her. But the skeleton he saw was not human. The bones were shaped like geometric lattice, like the internal structure of a snowflake. He realized then that the Tudor secret was not just a disease or a mutation. It was an invasion. The alchemical substances that John Dee had been administering, the potable gold and the white tincture, were rebuilding the Queen into something else. She was becoming a biological antenna, a vessel for a frequency that Dee believed came from the stars. This informative detail changes everything. The Virgin Queen was not just protecting her body from marriage. She was protecting her body from the human collective. She was being tuned to a different reality. This is why her presence was so hypnotic, why people felt they were in the presence of a goddess. They were. But it was a goddess made of poison and glass. Consider the geometry of the Queen's face in her later years. If you look at the Rainbow portrait or the Ditchley portrait, the proportions are strangely perfect. This is because the artificers were using mathematical principles, the golden ratio, to apply the cirrus. They were literally sculpting a new face onto the Queen's existing features, but as the internal transformation accelerated, the mask began to reject the flesh. The shattered mirror incident was the first sign of this rejection. The physical body was trying to breathe, trying to move, while the alchemical shell was trying to remain static. This created a state of constant internal tension. The Tier 1 listener understands that this is a metaphor for the empire itself. England was a small island trying to project a massive, unshakable image to the world. Inside, it was a mess of religious conflict and economic instability. The Queen's body was the empire's physical manifestation. The secret of the moral decay lies here. The council knew that the lead was destroying the Queen's internal organs. Her kidneys were failing, her lungs were scarred, but they continued the treatments. They valued the image of the Queen more than the life of the woman. They were the architects of her porcelain prison. Every morning, when Elizabeth looked in the mirror, she saw the mask being built higher and higher. She saw the eyes, the only part of her that remained human, sinking deeper into the white leaden shell. She was being buried alive in her own majesty. The atmospheric build reaches its peak in the silence of these mornings. The sun would rise over the Thames, but it would not be allowed into the room. The Queen would sit in the darkness, waiting for the artificers to begin their work, waiting for the first layer of the lie to be applied. She was the most powerful woman in the world, and she could not even move her own lips without permission from her mask. We must return to the summer of 1588 to see how this secret nearly cost England its life. When the news of the Spanish fleet reached the palace, Elizabeth insisted on going to Tilbury to address her troops. The council was in a state of panic. To ride a horse, to speak in the wind, to move among thousands of men, the risk of a structural failure was total. The speech at Tilbury is famous for the line, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Historians see this as a masterpiece of rhetoric. But look at the hidden truth Elizabeth was literally describing. Her body as a vessel that was separate from her internal kingly essence. On that day, she wore a silver breastplate over her white velvet dress. This breastplate was not for protection against Spanish bullets. It was a corset of iron designed to keep her torso from collapsing under the vibration of the horse's gait. She was held upright by a series of hidden braces and wires. The atmospheric build of that day was one of high tension and blinding light. The sun reflected off her silver armor and her white leaded face, making her appear like a glowing vision of a warrior goddess. The soldiers were awestruck. They didn't see a woman. They saw a miracle, but as she spoke, the wind whipped across the marsh, and the salt air began to react with the lead on her face. A small crack began to form near her ear. Walsingham, standing just behind her, saw it. He moved forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, ready to catch her if she shattered. She finished the speech and was hurried back to her carriage. The moment the doors were closed, she collapsed, not in a faint, but in a state of structural fatigue. The silver breastplate was the only thing holding her together. That night, back at the palace, the repairs took 14 hours. This is the cost of a viral hysteria, history that survives only because it is too terrifying to tell. What happens to a mind that is forced to live behind a mask for 40 years? The psychological layer of Elizabeth's story is one of profound isolation. By the end of the 1580s, she had begun to refer to herself in the third person. She would talk about the Queen as if she were a different entity. a statue that she was merely occupying for a time. She began to surround herself with mirrors, not the silver mirrors of her youth, but black obsidian mirrors provided by John Dee. These mirrors, he claimed, did not show the physical form, but the ethereal signature. When she looked into them, she didn't see the white lead or the porcelain skin. She saw the geometric lattice of her alchemical skeleton. This atmospheric build is one of deep, reflective sorrow. Imagine the Queen of England sitting in a room filled with black mirrors, looking for a glimpse of the woman she used to be. She would touch her face and feel only the cold, hard cerus. She would try to cry, but the lead would absorb the tears before they could fall, leaving behind a salty white stain. The forbidden knowledge here is that the transformation was not just physical, it was spiritual. Elizabeth was being refined like gold in a furnace. The Lidu was burning away her humanity, leaving behind something pure but utterly cold. The Tier 1 audience must ask, is this the ultimate goal of power? To become so perfect, so unchanging that you cease to be alive? The Tudor line was obsessed with legitimacy and legacy. They wanted to build a dynasty that would last forever. In Elizabeth, they succeeded. They built a woman who would never age, never decay, and never die in the eyes of history. But that night in Richmond, when the face cracked, the woman behind the mask finally spoke. The page who was taken to the Tower later told his cellmate that he heard the Queen whisper a single word as the crack spread across her cheek. She didn't call for help. She didn't call for her physicians. She whispered, finally. As we move toward the conclusion of this first chapter, we must consider the archive chill, the feeling that comes when you realize the history you have been taught is a carefully constructed stage play. The Tudor glass secret is not a myth. It is a biological reality that was managed by the highest levels of the English state. The sensory cues are all around us. The portraits with their flat, unearthly skin, the elaborate ruffs that look like stone carvings, the reports of the Queen's stiff, robotic dancing, the obsessive secrecy of her private chambers. All of these pieces fit together into a mosaic of a woman who became a monument, but the moral decay did not end with Elizabeth. The techniques used to preserve her, the alchemical fillers, the lead-based masks, the psychological isolation were passed down. The Porcelain Mandate became a blueprint for how to maintain the image of power in the face of inevitable human decay. Think of the candles in Richmond Palace, slowly burning down to their wicks. Think of the smell of the vinegar fading as the morning light begins to touch the tapestries. The shattered mirror was not just an accident. It was a warning. It was the physical body's last attempt to reclaim its reality from the alchemical shell, but the shell won. The repairs were made, the cracks were filled, and the secret was locked away in a casket of gold and lead. Elizabeth would live for another 15 years, becoming more and more translucent, more and more brittle, until the day she finally stopped. And yet, even in death, she was not allowed to decay. The official report says she died of old age and melancholy. The hidden truth is that she simply reached a level of calcification that the human heart could no longer support. She didn't die. She solidified, but as the artificers prepared her body for the final coronation of death, they discovered something that terrified them more than the porcelain skin. When they removed the final layer of the lead mask to prepare her for the embalming, they found that the crack from 1588 hadn't just remained. It had grown. And beneath the skin, something was beginning to emerge, something that was not bone, not glass, and certainly not human. To understand what lay beneath the porcelain, we must look at the secret rituals of the white lid chamber, and the woman who was hired to take Elizabeth's place in the dark, the image of Elizabeth. The first is a masterpiece of deception, a calculated lie sculpted from poison and silver, while the world marveled at the Virgin Queen's porcelain skin. The truth hidden beneath that white mask was a horror of biological betrayal. The substance known as Venetian ceruse was not a cosmetic. It was a funeral shroud applied to a living body. Every morning, in the deepest silence of the palace, the queen was subjected to a forbidden ritual that used toxic lead to seal the cracks in her very existence. The physicians knew the lead was eroding her mind. The advisors knew it was turning her bones to brittle glass. They chose to curse their monarch with a slow, agonizing petrification rather than reveal that the Tudor line had become something non-human. This was a secret buried in layers of white lead, a moral decay that traded a woman's soul for an empire's stability. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The heavy oak doors of the royal bedchamber are bolted from the within. Outside, the world of the 16th century is waking up to the sound of birds in the distant Thames, but in here, time is suspended in a thick amber haze. The candles have burned low, and the air is heavy with the sharp, metallic tang of the morning ritual. Close your eyes and breathe in the stillness of a secret being painted into life. The year is 1589, and the Palace of Whitehall is a labyrinth of whispers. We begin our journey in the Queen's inner sanctum, a room where the sun is never allowed to touch the floor. To the public, the Queen's morning toilet was a mystery of grace. To the 4 women chosen to serve her, it was a clinical operation. These women were the silent maids, chosen not for their beauty or status, but for their inability to speak or write. They were the keepers of the white lid ritual. Imagine the sound of a stone mortar and pestle grinding in the corner of the room. This is the heartbeat of the Tudor secret. The substance being prepared is Venetian ceruse, the most expensive and deadliest makeup in the world. It is a blend of high-grade white lead harvested from the mines of Italy, steeped in experimental vinegar for months until it achieves a texture like thick, cold cream. But in Elizabeth's chamber, the recipe has been altered. John Dee, the Queen's alchemist, has introduced a third ingredient, a fine, iridescent powder he calls the white tincture. This is the alchemical bridge intended to bind the toxic lead to the Queen's translucent, glass-like skin. As the maids begin the application, the room falls into a hypnotic rhythm. They do not use brushes. They use pieces of fine Spanish silk, dipped into the cold paste and pressed firmly against the Queen's forehead. The informative reality of the 16th century is often obscured by our modern ideas of beauty. For the Tier 1 audience seeking the hidden truth, we must look at the chemical warfare being waged on Elizabeth's body. Lead is a heavy metal that does not simply sit on the skin. It migrates. It seeks the marrow. As the first layer of ceruse is applied, it acts as a cooling agent, numbing the nerves of the face. For a woman whose body was in a constant state of structural tension, this numbness was a form of mercy. But the cost was total. The lead began to replace the calcium in her facial structure. Over decades, her jawbone and cheekbones were no longer made of biological tissue. They were becoming a mineral deposit, the secret ledgers of the royal apothecary, hidden for centuries in the archives of the Lambeth Palace, record the purchase of massive quantities of rosewater and honey. These were not for scent. They were used to wash away the gray, metallic discharge that leaked from the queen's pores every night as her body tried and failed to reject the lead. The ritual was an act of architectural reinforcement. The maids would apply layer after layer, waiting for each to dry into a hard, enamel-like finish. This was the mask of majesty. It was so thick that the queen could no longer produce facial expressions. If she laughed too suddenly, the mask would fracture. If she frowned, the lead would tear the fragile, translucent skin beneath it. She became a prisoner of her own face, a living statue whose only means of communication were her eyes and her voice. This is the psychological weight of the Tudor secret. To rule a nation, she had to cease to be a person. She had to become an icon, a static image that never aged and never changed. The moral decay of her advisors was their willingness to watch her turn into a monument of poison, day by day, for the sake of the crown's continuity. As the morning progresses, the ritual enters its most dangerous phase. John Dee believed that the lead was not just a covering, but a catalyst for a spiritual transformation. He argued that by sealing the queen's pores with a heavy metal, they were forcing her internal sulfur or soul to remain trapped within the body, preventing the natural decay of time. In the quiet of the chamber, as the third layer of the white lead is buffed to a high shine, the air begins to vibrate with a low subharmonic frequency. This is the sound of the queen's breathing. Because the mask has restricted her lung capacity, her breath is shallow and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock. The informative layer here is the connection between the makeup and the glass bone mutation we discussed previously. The lead in the cerus was reacting with the alchemical tinctures Elizabeth was drinking. It created a synergistic effect that accelerated the calcification of her joints. By 1590, her neck was so stiff that she required the great ruff to act as a physical stabilizer. The ruff was not a fashion statement. It was a medical brace disguised as lace. The Tier 1 listener must understand the sheer physical endurance required for this existence. The queen would sit for 4 hours every morning as the mask was built. She would not speak. She would enter a state of deep meditative trance, her mind drifting away from her petrifying body. She was practicing for the day. She would finally become a statue forever. The forbidden knowledge of the Tudor court was that the queen was no longer a biological entity by the traditional definition. She was a hybrid of alchemy and anatomy. The white lead was the glue holding her together. Without it, her skin would have been so clear that the court would have seen the geometric, crystalline structures of her internal organs. The makeup was the only thing keeping the world from seeing the other that Elizabeth had become. We must now turn our attention to the women who performed this ritual. The silent maids lived a life of gilded imprisonment. They were never allowed to leave the palace. They were never allowed to speak to anyone outside their small circle. Their only purpose was to manage the queen's decay. The atmosphere in their shared quarters was one of muted terror. They saw the queen without her mask. They saw the third face, the raw, translucent reality that existed beneath the lead. One of these maids, a woman whose name survives only as M, kept a secret record using charcoal on the underside of her bed frame. She wrote of the way the queen's skin would hum when the lead was removed at night. She wrote of the archive chill that filled the room whenever the mask was cracked. She described the queen's eyes as windows into a void, two dark orbs floating in a sea of white enamel. The psychological layer here is the shared trauma of the ritual. The maids were poisoning themselves by handling the lead every day. Their own hair began to fall out. Their own teeth grew loose. They were sacrifices on the altar of the Tudor image. The moral decay of the state extended to everyone who touched the Queen. The informative detail of their daily routine involves the use of mercury-based washes to remove the lead at night. Mercury is even more toxic than lead. The removal of the mask was a process of chemical flaying. Every night, the Queen's face was burned by the mercury to clear the lead, and every morning it was resealed with new poison. This cycle of destruction and reconstruction is what kept the Virgin Queen eternal. As the sun climbs higher outside the heavy velvet curtains, the final layer of the white lead ritual is completed. The maids now apply the highlights, small veins of blue paint around the temples and a deep, blood-red tint to the lips. This was the final irony of the Tudor secret. They used paint to simulate the very life that the lead had destroyed. The Queen stands up. Her movements are slow and deliberate. She has to learn her face again every morning. She tests the tension of the mask by humming a single low note. If the mask holds, she is ready to face the world. The Tier 1 audience must recognize the hypnotic pacing of this life. Elizabeth lived in a world where every second was calculated. She could not afford a spontaneous movement. She could not afford an unplanned word. She was a performance artist whose stage was the throne of England. The moral decay of this era is found in the letters of the foreign ambassadors who visited the court. They spoke of the static radiance of the Queen. They were mesmerized by her stillness. They didn't realize they were looking at a woman who was literally paralyzed by her own beauty routine. They mistook a chemical prison for divine grace. The informative reality of her mask of youth is that it actually became more convincing as she got older. Because the lead filled in every wrinkle and every pore, she appeared to have the skin of a 20-year-old even in her 60s. But it was a skin that had no warmth. It was a skin that did not sweat. It was a skin that smelled of metal and vinegar. This is the forbidden knowledge that ensures your retention. The Queen was a living ghost. She was the first human to be fully re-engineered by the state. The British Empire was not ruled by a woman. It was ruled by a consensus of advisors who managed a biological artifact. What happens to the soul when the body is turned to stone? John Dee's journal suggests that Elizabeth's mind began to fragment under the influence of the lead. She started to experience visions of the crystalline plane. She believed she could see through walls, that she could hear the thoughts of the Spanish king across the sea. This was likely lead-induced psychosis. But to the Tudor court, it was divine prophecy. They used her hallucinations to guide state policy. The white lead ritual was not just about maintaining an image. It was about maintaining a biological oracle. The atmosphere in the palace during these sessions was one of religious awe. The advisors would gather in the shadows as the Queen, her face frozen in its white mask, would whisper strings of incoherent numbers and names. They believed they were hearing the voice of God. They were actually hearing the screams of a nervous system being crushed by heavy metal. The informative depth of this psychological layer is profound. It shows how the state can turn a medical tragedy into a political tool. The moral decay was total. They didn't want Elizabeth to be healthy. They wanted her to be useful. They needed her to be the unchanging symbol of England. Even if that meant she had to lose her mind in the process. The archive chill returns when we realize that many of the Golden Age successes, the defeat of the Armada, the expansion into the New World, were directed by a woman who was in the throes of heavy metal poisoning. The stability of the West was built on the hallucinations of a glass-boned queen dot as the ritual ends. The maids bow and retreat into the shadows. The queen is alone again, standing before her mirror. She looks at the white, unmoving face. She reaches out a hand to touch the glass, but she stops. She knows that if her hand touches the mirror, the sound will be the same. The sound of glass meeting glass dot in the final hour of the morning. Before the doors are opened to the Privy Council, the Queen is fitted into her public persona. This involves the placement of the great ruff and the pinning of the hero wig made of red silk and human hair harvested from the silent maids. The ruff is the final piece of the structural puzzle. It is constructed from layers of starched linen, reinforced with hidden wires of silver and iron. It serves a dual purpose. First, it creates a visual separation between the divine head and the mortal body. Second, it provides a resting place for the queen's chin, taking the weight off her fragile jawbone. The informative detail here is the tension of the throne. Every moment Elizabeth sat in state, she was fighting against gravity. The ruff and the corset were her exoskeleton. Without them, she would have slumped into a heap of brittle bone and white paste, the Tier 1. Listener should imagine the sensory experience of this. The scratch of the starch against the neck, the weight of the silver wires, the constant metallic taste of the lead on the lips. The hypnotic pacing of her day was dictated by the limits of her equipment. She could only remain in the ruff for 4 hours before the pressure on her spine became unbearable. This is why her audiences were so short. This is why she was known for her mercurial temper. She was in constant agonizing pain. The moral decay was the court's insistence that she remain in this torture device to satisfy the public's need for a goddess. The forbidden knowledge of the ruff is that it was also a sound catcher. The shape of the lace was designed to funnel sound toward her ears as the lead poisoning was slowly making her deaf. The Virgin Queen was a woman living in a world of silence, encased in a cage of silver and lace, looking out at her kingdom through a mask of poison. As we breathe in the quiet air of the chamber, we realize that the white lead ritual was the ultimate act of betrayal. It was the state deciding that a woman's life was worth less than her image. It was the birth of the modern cult of personality, where the person is sacrificed to the icon. The candles are out now. The room is cold. The queen is ready. She signals to the maids, and the heavy oak bolts are pulled back. The sound of the world rushes in, but Elizabeth does not flinch. She cannot. She is the porcelain queen, and her day has begun long after Elizabeth's death. The legacy of the white lead ritual remained. When her body was finally laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, the embalmers were faced with a problem. The skin was so saturated with lead and mercury that it refused to decay in the normal way. She was, in effect, already mummified by her own makeup. The informative reality of her tomb is that it contains a body that is more mineral than organic. If one were to open the casket today, they would find a skeleton that glows under certain frequencies. A skeletal structure reinforced by the alchemical experiments of John Dee. The archive chill is the realization that the golden age is still with us, literalized in the bones of its greatest monarch. The white lead was not just a historical curiosity. It was a transformative agent that changed the course of human biology and political theater. The psychological layer for the Tier 1 audience is the question: what masks do we wear today? What poisons do we accept to maintain our own images of stability and power? The Tudor secret is a mirror held up to our own moral decay. The hypnotic pacing of the story now slows to a crawl. Think of the dust motes dancing in the light of the abandoned chamber. Think of the mortar and pestle sitting silent on the table. The ritual is over, but the consequences will last for centuries. The forbidden knowledge is the understanding that history is not what happened. It is what we were allowed to see. We were allowed to see the Virgin Queen. We were not allowed to see the woman of glass dying behind the mask of lead as you drift closer to the edge of sleep. Imagine the weight of that mask. Imagine the silence of that room. The world of 1589 is fading into the shadows of the past, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth of the Porcelain Queen. The Tudor line ended not with a bang, but with the soft, crystalline sound of a body becoming stone. In the final moments of our deep dive into the white-laid ritual, we must listen to the whispers that history tried to erase. The silent maids, despite their vows and their infirmities, left behind a legacy of ghost stories. They spoke of the night of the silver sweat, when the Queen's body attempted to purge the lead all at once. They described the Queen standing in the middle of the room, her skin shimmering with a metallic fluid, her eyes wide with a terror that she couldn't express because her face was frozen. This atmospheric build is the dark heart of the story. It is the moment where the moral decay becomes a physical reality. The advisors stood by and watched this happen, taking notes on the alchemical progress instead of offering help. The informative depth here is the realization that Elizabeth was the first test subject for a new kind of power, the power of the eternal icon. The state learned that if you can control the image of the leader, you can control the mind of the nation. The white lead ritual was the laboratory where this control was perfected. The Tier 1 listener, moving into the final stages of relaxation, can feel the archive chill one last time. It is the cold breath of a history that is more machine than human. It is the realization that the Virgin Queen was the most lonely person in the world, surrounded by people who loved her mask but feared her flesh. The story of the lead is a story of boundaries. The boundary between the living and the dead. The boundary between the woman and the monarch. The boundary between the truth and the lie. Elizabeth lived her entire life on those boundaries, held in place by a paste of vinegar and poison. As the light of the 16th century fades from your mind, remember the sound of the grinding mortar. Remember the smell of the metallic air. The Tudor secret is safe for now, buried in the white silence of the past. But secrets have a way of surfacing, like the blue veins beneath a porcelain skin. But the silent maids saw something even more terrifying than the Queen's skin. In the dead of winter, when the lead was at its coldest, they noticed that the Queen was no longer the only one in the room with a porcelain face. There was a voice coming from the shadow of the bed curtains, a voice that sounded exactly like Elizabeth, but it was coming from a body that hadn't moved in hours. To understand who or what was truly ruling England from behind the veil, we must look at the Maid of Honor's testimony. And the night the Queen's body was found in two places at once, history is a tapestry woven to hide a monstrosity. We have been conditioned to believe that Queen Elizabeth I was a woman of flesh and blood, but the forbidden testimony of her closest confidant, Mary Radcliffe, reveals a betrayal of nature itself. Hidden in a hollowed-out floorboard of a manor house for 4 centuries, Radcliffe's diary describes a monarch whose body was undergoing a terrifying alchemical transformation into a living crystalline statue. This was not a disease. It was a curse born of forbidden experiments that turned her skin into a translucent shell and her bones into brittle glass. The queen you saw in public was a carefully constructed lie, a porcelain mask held together by lead and fear. But behind the closed doors of the bedchamber, the woman was disappearing, replaced by a substance that caught the light in ways no human body should. The church knew. The spy masters knew. They watched as her humanity was replaced by a cold, transparent void. They chose to let her shatter in private rather than admit the Tudor line had become a biological anomaly. Every portrait you have ever seen is a cover-up for a woman who was literally turning into a window. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Outside the thick stone walls of the palace, the wind of 1591 howls through the empty courtyards, but here, inside the heavy velvet curtains, the world is frozen. There is a specific stillness in this room, a silence so deep it feels like the bottom of a dark, cold lake. Settle into the shadows of the past and listen to the rhythmic scratching of a quill as a terrified woman records the impossible. Mary Radcliffe was not a politician or a soldier. She was a maid of honor, a woman whose entire existence was dedicated to the physical proximity of the Queen in the hierarchy of the Tudor court. Proximity was power, but for Mary it was a source of mounting dread. By the year 1591, the atmosphere in the royal apartments had shifted from one of courtly elegance to one of clinical isolation. The air was permanently thick with the sharp, acidic smell of vinegar and the heavy, sweet scent of the white lead ceruse. Mary's duty was simple yet harrowing. She was one of the few permitted to touch the Queen's garments. It was during a late October evening that the first crack in her reality appeared. As she helped Elizabeth disrobe, a process that took hours of agonizingly slow movement, the candlelight caught the Queen's bare shoulder. Mary stopped. She did not see the soft, wrinkled skin of a woman in her late 50s. Instead, she saw something that looked like frosted glass. The light didn't reflect off the skin. It passed through it. Beneath the surface, Mary could see the skeletal structure of the shoulder, but the bones were not the creamy white of human remains. They were a deep obsidian black, etched with silver lines that looked like the veins in a leaf. She described it in her diary as a shimmering lattice, a geometric pattern that seemed to vibrate with a low, subaudible hum. The Queen did not flinch. She did not explain. She simply stared into the dark mirror, her eyes two hollow voids in a face of white enamel. This was the moment Mary realized that the monarch she served was no longer an inhabitant of the natural world. The informative depth of Radcliffe's testimony lies in her. Observations of the Queen's nocturnal habits. Elizabeth had stopped sleeping in the traditional sense. She would remain upright in a high-backed chair of ebony and silk, her body supported by a series of hidden braces. Mary, stationed at the foot of the bed, watched through the semi-transparent veil of the bed curtains. She noted that the Queen would remain motionless for 6, sometimes 7 hours at a time. During these hours, a strange phenomenon would occur. As the room grew colder, the Queen's skin would begin to exhibit a faint phosphorescent glow. It was a pale, rhythmic light that synchronized with the tides of the Thames flowing outside. Mary noted that when the tide was high, the Queen's skin was almost entirely opaque. But as the tide receded, the translucency would return, revealing more of the internal, crystalline architecture. The psychological layer of this observation is profound. Elizabeth was no longer a person. She was a biological clock, a vessel tuned to the planetary movements of the Earth itself. Radcliffe's diary asks a question that resonates through the centuries. Who was ruling England during those hours? Was it the woman or was it the frequency? The archive chill comes from the realization that the Elizabethan era was not directed by human logic, but by a rhythmic, cold intelligence that resided within the Queen's petrifying frame. The moral decay of the court was their silent acceptance of this. Lord Burleigh would enter the room in the early morning, look at the glowing, glass-like figure in the chair, and simply nod. He would then begin discussing the taxation of wool or the movements of the Scottish army as if he were speaking to a living woman. They had traded their queen's humanity for a static, immortal symbol. They preferred a statue that could not die to a woman who could dot. As we move deeper into the winter of 1591, Radcliffe records a change in the Queen's speech. This is the phonetic dissolution that precedes a total physical transformation. Elizabeth's voice, once sharp and commanding, began to take on a metallic, resonant quality. It sounded like air passing through a hollow glass pipe. She stopped using personal pronouns. She no longer spoke of I or me. She spoke of the crown as if it were a physical organ of her body. Mary describes a specific incident during a private reading of Virgil. As the Queen attempted to pronounce certain words, her jaw would emit a soft, crystalline clicking sound. It was the sound of gears made of bone. Radcliffe realized that the alchemical substances John Dee was administering were not just preserving her skin. They were rebuilding her vocal cords. The informative reality of the 16th century was that they lacked the words for what we might call bioengineering today. Mary called it a possession of the salt. She believed the salt in the Queen's blood was crystallizing, turning her from a creature of water and fire into a creature of earth and light. The Queen's words became increasingly abstract, focusing on geometry, the movements of the stars, and the great music of the spheres. She was losing her connection to the English language. Just as she was losing her connection to English soil, the retention strategy for this part of the narrative is to understand the isolation of the witness. Mary Radcliffe was surrounded by courtiers who pretended everything was normal. She was the only one who allowed herself to feel the terror. She describes nights where she would weep into her pillow, not for the Queen, but for the world. If the monarch could turn into glass, what was stopping the stone walls of the palace from turning into smoke? The stability of her entire reality was shattering, perhaps the most shocking. Part of the testimony involves the Richmond double. Mary records a night in December when she was sent to fetch a bowl of warmed wine for the Queen. As she walked through the long gallery, she saw the Queen standing at a window, looking out over the frozen gardens. The Queen was dressed in her full state robes, her face a perfect, white-leaded mask, but Mary knew the Queen was currently in her bedchamber, undergoing the polishing ritual with the silent maids. Terrified, Mary approached the figure at the window. The figure did not turn. It did not breathe. It was a perfect, life-sized automaton, a shell made of wood and wax, dressed in the Queen's clothes. When Mary returned to the bedchamber, she saw the real Elizabeth, or what was left of her, sitting in the amber light. The Queen's skin was so clear that Mary could see the wine moving down her throat, a dark red ribbon flowing through a glass tube. The Queen looked at Mary and whispered a single sentence that was never meant to be heard. She said, "The one at the window is the one they love. I am the one they use." This informative detail reveals the true extent of the conspiracy. The Tudor court had built a literal replacement for the Queen. a static object that could perform the public duties while the real Elizabeth was consumed by the alchemical fire. The moral decay was total. They had created a duplicate to ensure that the people never saw the glass woman. They had turned the monarchy into a theater of the macabre. Mary realized that if she ever spoke of this, she would be replaced just as easily. She was a witness to a world that had become a hall of mirrors, where the real and the fake were indistinguishable. By the spring of 1592, the transformation reached a point of crisis. Radcliffe's diary entries become more frantic, written in a cramped, hurried script. She describes the alchemical rejection. The Queen's body, now nearly 60% crystalline, began to reject the heavy lead makeup. The cerus would no longer stick to the skin. It would slide off in thick, gray sheets, revealing the shimmering, translucent tissue beneath. The physicians were in a state of panic. If the Queen appeared in public with glass-like skin, the religious foundations of the kingdom would collapse. They began to use stronger adhesives, resins brought from the deepest jungles of the Americas, to glue the mask to the Queen's face. Mary describes the sound of the application, the wet, tearing sound as the resin was pressed onto the delicate, transparent skin. The psychological layer here is the Queen's resignation. She no longer resisted. She sat like a doll as they glued her face together. Radcliffe notes that the Queen had stopped blinking. Her eyelids, now thin and clear as parchment, had become too stiff to move. She stared out at her advisors with a fixed, unblinking gaze that felt like it was burning through them. The informative layer for the Tier 1 audience is the realization that this was a medical torture. The lead was poisoning her mind while the resin was suffocating her skin. She was being preserved like a biological specimen in a jar. The forbidden knowledge is the fact that the English Golden Age was built on the silent, agonizing petrification of its leader. Mary Radcliffe writes that the smell in the room was no longer of vinegar, but of cold ozone and dead stars. The Queen was no longer smelling like a human. She was smelling like the void between the planets. We must look closer at the glass bone progression. Mary describes a day when a small glass bowl was dropped in the Queen's presence. The sound of the shattering glass caused the Queen to flinch. Mary saw a hairline fracture appear on the Queen's wrist. Right beneath the surface of the clear skin, the Queen didn't bleed. Instead, a small amount of fine white dust leaked from the crack. It was the same crystalline dust that the silent maids had been polishing away for months. Mary realized that the Queen's marrow had been entirely replaced by this salt-like substance. She was hollow. She was a vessel filled with the dust of her own transformation. This is the archive chill. The realization that the heart of the British Empire was an empty glass shell filled with alchemical dust. The moral decay of the advisors was their obsession with the purity of this dust. John Dee would collect the dust from the floor and store it in silver vials, claiming it was the materia prima, the base substance of the universe. They were literally harvesting their queen as she broke apart. The retention of this story depends on the visceral nature of this image. A queen who leaks dust instead of blood. A monarch who is a literal hourglass, her time running out as she turns to sand. Radcliffe's diary becomes a record of a slow-motion explosion. She knew that eventually the tension would become too much. The glass could only hold so much pressure before it turned to shards. In the final sections of the diary found in the floorboards, Radcliffe explores the mind of the glass woman. She describes a conversation they had in the dead of night, when the palace was at its most quiet. The Queen spoke of the sensation of being glass. She said she could feel every vibration in the building. She could feel the mice in the walls, the wind on the roof, and the heartbeat of the guards in the hall. She said that because she was translucent, she could no longer hide her thoughts. She felt as though the light was passing through her mind just as it passed through her skin. This created a state of absolute, terrifying honesty. She saw the greed in Burleigh's eyes. She saw the fear in Mary's heart. She saw the ambition in the young courtiers who danced in the long gallery. The psychological layer for our listeners is the horror of being seen entirely. Elizabeth was the most powerful person in the world, yet she was the most vulnerable because she had no privacy even within her own body. She was a glass house that everyone was looking into, but no one was willing to help dot the informative detail of this part of the testimony is the Queen's obsession with the Great Seal. She insisted that her face on the coins and the seals remain the same as it was in 1558. She wanted the world to see the image, even if she had become a window. The moral decay of the state was their role as the curators of this window. They were the ones who decided what the light would reveal and what it would hide. Radcliffe concludes this section with a haunting thought. If we are all made in the image of God, then God must be a cold, clear thing that does not feel the sun. As we reach the end of Mary Radcliffe's hidden diary, the pacing slows to a crawl. The year is now 1593. The Queen's transformation has reached its plateau. She is now almost entirely immobile. She sits on her throne like a diamond set in gold, her face a thick, white mask that is no longer hers. Mary writes of the final ritual. They had to coat the Queen's entire body in a thin layer of liquid silver to keep the light from passing through her during the opening of Parliament. The Queen was a silvered mirror reflecting the world back at itself. She was no longer a person. She was an optical effect. The archive chill returns as Radcliffe describes the Queen's eyes one last time. They were the only part that hadn't turned to glass. They were two wet, human things trapped in a silver and porcelain cage. Mary saw them moving, darting back and forth, pleading for someone to break the glass. But no one moved. The ceremony continued. The Queen was carried into the hall, a static, shimmering god. The moral decay was complete. The state had their eternal monarch. The people had their virgin queen, and Mary Radcliffe had her diary, the only record of the woman who had been erased. Radcliffe died shortly after writing these words, her own health failing from the years of breathing in the lead and the vinegar. But her voice remains a whisper from the floorboards, telling us that the history we know is a lie. The informative reality of the Tudor line is that the glass body did not end with Elizabeth. When we look at the strange, sudden illnesses of her successors, the erratic behavior of the Stuart kings, and the obsession with secrecy that defines the British monarchy to this day, we see the shadows of the alchemical experiments of 1591. The forbidden knowledge is the understanding that power is a transformative substance. It changes the biology of those who hold it. It turns flesh into stone and blood into lead. Elizabeth was the first, but she was not the last. The archive chill is the feeling that if we look closely enough at the portraits of our own leaders, we might see the same silver lines, the same geometric lattice, the same translucent skin, the psychological layer for the listener, drifting now into a deep, heavy sleep, is the realization that we are all, in some way, turning to glass. We are all becoming more transparent in the age of information. We are all wearing masks to hide our internal fractures. The Tudor secret is our own secret, projected back to us from the 16th century. The story of the Maid of Honor is a story of the cost of seeing the truth. Mary Radcliffe saw the Queen for what she was, and it broke her heart. But in her testimony, she gave us the only thing that could survive the alchemical fire, the truth. The glass body may have shattered, but the words remain, etched into the silence of the past. As the darkness of the room surrounds you, imagine the Queen sitting in her ebony chair. The candles are flickering and the air is cold. She looks into the mirror, and for a brief second, the lead mask slips. She sees the glass. She sees the light. And she sees the shadow of a man standing behind her, a man with a silver quill and a heart of ice. This is the end of Mary Radcliffe's story, but it is only the beginning of the Tudor nightmare. The secret was safe, the diary was buried, and the Queen was a statue once more. But in the laboratories of the palace, John Dee was already preparing for the next phase. He was no longer interested in the Queen's skin. He was interested in her soul. The moral decay was moving from the physical to the metaphysical. The state had mastered the body. Now they wanted to master the spirit. The informative depth of this transition is what defines the next chapter of our hidden history. The Tudor line was not just a dynasty. It was an alchemical engine fueled by the lives of those who served it. Breathe in the stillness of the night. The palace is quiet. The Thames is flowing. The glass woman is waiting. The history you have been told is a dream. The truth is much colder and much clearer, but as Mary Radcliffe closed her diary for the last time, she noticed something in the Queen's great silver mirror that she had never seen before. It wasn't a reflection of the room. It was a doorway. And standing on the other side of that doorway was a version of Elizabeth that wasn't made of glass, but of pure burning shadow. To understand what happens when the porcelain mask finally meets its reflection, we must look at John Dee's alchemical mirror, a reflection from another world. And the ritual that nearly pulled all of London into the void, the most guarded secret of the Elizabethan age was not a political treaty or a hidden heir, but an object of obsidian blackness that defied the laws of the physical world. While the public saw Queen Elizabeth I as a symbol of divine order, her power was anchored to a forbidden ritual involving a scrying mirror brought from the blood-soaked altars of the Aztec Empire. This mirror was not a tool for vanity, but a portal into a dimension of shadow that John Dee, the Queen's occult advisor, called the celestial plane. The betrayal of the English soul occurred the moment Elizabeth looked into that black stone and realized her own reflection was no longer her own. This mirror was the true source of her biological transformation. It was the catalyst that began turning her skin into porcelain and her bones into glass. To maintain the illusion of a human monarch, the state buried the truth of the entities that whispered from the glass. They were trading the Queen's sanity for forbidden knowledge of the future. The moral decay of the Tudor court was their willingness to invite an otherworldly parasite into the heart of London to ensure a victory against Spain. The Queen was a hollow vessel, and the mirror was the thing filling her with a cold, crystalline light. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move away from the crowded halls of Parliament and into the deepest, most silent corner of the palace. Here, the walls are draped in heavy, dark velvet to absorb any sound that might escape. The only light comes from a single, thick candle made of animal tallow and sage. The air is cold, carrying the faint, metallic scent of obsidian and the musk of ancient dust. Settle into the stillness and feel the weight of the darkness as it gathers around the edges of the black mirror. To understand the mystery of the mirror, we must trace its journey across the gray Atlantic. It was a fragment of volcanic glass, polished to a perfect, dark shine by the high priests of a civilization that understood the geometry of the void far better than the scholars of Europe. When the Spanish conquistadors looted the temples, they saw only a curiosity. But when it fell into the hands of John Dee, he recognized it for what it truly was, a bridge. Dee was a man of immense intellect, a mathematician who could map the stars and a navigator who could guide ships through the most treacherous seas. Yet his greatest obsession was the language of the angels. He believed that the physical world was merely a veil, and that by using the black mirror, he could pull that veil aside. In the year 1592, the atmosphere in Dee's study at Mortlake was one of suppressed hysteria. He had spent years refining the show stone, bathing it in salts and oils that mirrored the chemical composition of the Queen's own blood. The informative depth of this period is often lost in traditional history. Dee wasn't just a mystic. He was the Queen's private spy, the original agent of the state who signed his letters with 2 circles and a square, the precursor to the modern codes of espionage. He convinced Elizabeth that the mirror could show the movements of the Spanish fleet weeks before they appeared on the horizon. But the price of this foresight was a biological contract. The mirror did not just show the future. It required a physical anchor in this world to maintain the connection. That anchor was the Queen. The psychological layer for the Tier 1 listener is the realization of the Queen's desperation. She was already beginning to feel the stiffening of her joints and the thinning of her skin. She saw the mirror as a way to transcend her failing body. She did not realize that the mirror was the very thing accelerating her decay. Every time she looked into the obsidian surface, the black stone pulled a little more of her humanity into the glass, replacing her warmth with the cold, static integrity of a crystal. The room where the mirror was kept was a masterpiece of occult architecture. John Dee had designed it using the principles of Euclidean geometry, ensuring that every angle reflected the light back toward the center of the obsidian stone. The floor was etched with silver lines that formed a massive, complex seal, a protection against the shadow court that resided within the glass. The sensory cues of this chamber were unique. There was a constant, low-frequency hum that seemed to come from the stone itself. It was a sound that resonated in the teeth and the bones, a vibration that made the glass windows of the palace rattle in their frames. The maids who cleaned the room spoke of an archive chill that never left the space, even in the height of summer. They reported that the shadows in the room moved independently of the light, stretching toward the mirror as if they were being drawn into a vacuum. Mary Radcliffe, the maid of honor whose testimony we explored previously, noted that the Queen spent more time in this room than in her own bedchamber. Elizabeth would sit for hours, her porcelain face inches from the black surface. She was not looking at her reflection. She was looking through it. The informative reality of the scrying sessions was that they were highly structured operations. Edward Kelly, Dee's medium, would sit on the opposite side, his eyes rolled back, his voice a distorted rasp as he translated the whispers of the angels. These entities did not speak of peace or spirituality. They spoke of mathematics, of the great synthesis, and of the necessity of the Queen's transformation. They told Elizabeth that her body was a cocoon, and that the glass skin she was developing was the first stage of her ascension into a higher form of existence. This was the lie that kept her hooked. The moral decay of John Dee was his knowledge that the angels were actually parasitic intelligences that were slowly consuming the Queen's vital essence to fuel their own entry into our world. He saw her as a necessary sacrifice for the advancement of human knowledge. As the winter of 1592 deepened, a terrifying phenomenon began to occur. During a scrying session, the Queen's reflection in the black mirror began to move on its own. While Elizabeth remained perfectly still, her image in the glass would turn its head, look around the room, and smile. It was a smile that Mary Radcliffe described as a fracture in the soul. The reflection's skin was not covered in white lead. It was raw, shimmering, and completely transparent. Through the glass, the witnesses could see the internal workings of the Mirror Queen. They saw the silver veins, the obsidian bones, and a heart that looked like a faceted diamond. It was a vision of what Elizabeth was becoming. The psychological layer of this event was the total breakdown of the Queen's identity. She began to speak of the reflection as the true self and of her own physical body as the husk. The informative detail of this period involves the state's reaction. Lord Burleigh and the spymaster Walsingham did not stop the sessions. Instead, they began to use the Mirror Queen to test their policies. They believed the reflection was more objective, more calculated, and less hindered by human emotion. They were essentially allowing an otherworldly entity to dictate the laws of England. This is the ultimate moral decay of the Tudor state. They had replaced their monarch with an alchemical simulation because it was more efficient. The archive chill returns when we consider the sound of the mirror during these moments. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It was the sound of thousands of tiny needles scratching against the back of the glass. It was the sound of the entities trying to push their way through. Elizabeth would place her hand against the obsidian, and where her skin touched the stone, the translucence would spread. Her hand would become as clear as the mirror itself, the light of the candle passing through her palm and casting a shadow of her glass. Bones onto the velvet curtains. Modern science might look back at John Dee's experiments and see only superstition. But the Tier 1 audience understands that there is a physics to the void. Dee's journals are filled with complex calculations regarding the refractive index of the soul. He believed that the obsidian mirror worked by slowing down the frequency of light until it matched the vibration of the celestial plane. He noted that in the presence of the mirror, time behaved differently. A scrying session that lasted only an hour according to the palace clocks would feel like an eternity to the Queen. She would emerge from the chamber with her eyes dilated and her skin cold to the touch. This hypnotic pacing of the narrative is essential to understanding the Queen's state of mind. She was living in two timelines at once, the slow, petrifying reality of her body, and the infinite, shimmering reality of the glass. The informative layer here is the physical toll of this temporal displacement. The Queen began to lose her sense of the present. She would answer questions that hadn't been asked yet, or speak to people who had been dead for decades. The court dismissed this as the eccentricity of age, but Mary Radcliffe knew better. She saw that the Queen was being unstitched. From the fabric of our world. The moral decay was the advisor's decision to weaponize this condition. They realized that because the Queen was partly in another dimension, she could see through the walls of the Spanish king's private cabinet in the Escorial. They turned her medical and spiritual tragedy into a tool for global dominance. They sat her before the mirror and forced her to watch the secrets of their enemies. even as the mirror drained the last of her human warmth. The Queen was no longer a person to them. She was a biological telescope, a window into the forbidden dot by the spring of 1593. The mirror's influence had grown so strong that the Queen could no longer stand the sight of natural sunlight. The UV rays seemed to cause her skin to vibrate with a painful, high-pitched frequency. John Dee devised a new ritual to stabilize her form. He called it the silver bath. In the dead of night, the silent maids would fill a large stone tub with a mixture of liquid mercury, rose water, and a suspension of ground obsidian. The Queen would submerge herself in this fluid for hours, the silver liquid filling the pores of her skin and reinforcing the glass-like structure of her bones. The sensory cues of this ritual were haunting. The sound of the heavy, metallic fluid splashing against the stone. The sight of the Queen's white-leaded head floating on the surface of the silver, her eyes wide and unblinking. The informative depth of the silver bath is its connection to the glass bone mutation. The mercury was acting as a conductor, further synchronizing the Queen's biology with the frequency of the black mirror. When she emerged from the bath, she would glow with a faint, metallic sheen that even the thickest layer of ceruse could not entirely hide. This is why in her later portraits her skin has a luminous, almost pearl-like quality. It wasn't the painter's skill. It was the residue of the mercury. The psychological layer for the listener is the sheer loneliness of this existence. Elizabeth was literally becoming a different state of matter. She could no longer feel the heat of the fire or the softness of a silk pillow. She felt only the cold, hard reality of the alchemical synthesis. She was a monument of silver and glass, existing in a palace of flesh and stone. The moral decay of the Tudor line was their refusal to let her die. They kept her submerged in the silver, kept her eyes fixed on the black mirror, because they were terrified of what would happen if the portal were ever closed. The most terrifying. Entry in John Dee's secret diary, the one written in a code that took 3 centuries to break, describes the night the shadow court began to manifest outside the mirror. It was late in 1593. The scrying session had been particularly intense. The Mirror Queen had been speaking for hours, providing detailed maps of the gold mines in the New World. Suddenly, the surface of the obsidian mirror began to ripple like water. A hand, made of the same dark, shimmering glass as the reflection, reached out of the stone and gripped the edge of the silver frame. Then a figure emerged. It was not the Queen. It was a tall, thin entity with a face like a geometric mask. Its body composed of interlocking crystalline plates. Dee did not flee. He fell to his knees in a state of religious ecstasy. The entity did not speak with words, but with a series of rhythmic clicks and hums that resonated in the air. It walked toward the Queen, who remained in her trance, and placed its cold, transparent fingers against her cheek. Where it touched her, the white lead makeup instantly evaporated, revealing the glass skin beneath. The informative detail of this event is the state's cover-up. The guards outside the room heard the sound of breaking glass and the Queen's low, metallic hum. They were told it was an experimental clock being tested by Dee. In reality, the palace had been breached by an intelligence from the celestial plane. The moral decay of the court was their decision to negotiate with this entity. Walsingham saw an opportunity to create a secret police that could move through walls and hear whispers in the dark. They allowed the entities to remain in the palace, hidden in the shadows of the velvet curtains, in exchange for the continued stability of the Tudor throne. The Queen was no longer the ruler of England. She was the diplomat to a nightmare. As the years progressed, the presence of the entities changed the atmosphere of the palace itself. The archive chill was no longer confined to the scrying chamber. It spread through the corridors, causing the candles to flicker with a blue flame and the wine in the cellars to turn to vinegar. The people of London began to whisper about the ghost of Whitehall, unaware that the ghost was actually a biological reality. The psychological layer for the Tier 1 audience is the impact on the Queen's sanity. Elizabeth began to see the world as a series of transparent layers. She could see the blood moving through her courtiers' veins, the greed in their hearts, and the rot in their bones. This total vision was a curse. She could no longer trust anyone because she could see the falsehood in their very anatomy. John Dee continued to monitor her refractive index. He noted that her body was becoming so dense with obsidian and silver that she was becoming physically heavier. It took 4 men to carry her sedan chair, and the floors of the palace had to be reinforced with iron beams to prevent them from buckling under her weight. This informative detail highlights the physical reality of the Porcelain Queen. She was a literal burden on the state, a monument of heavy metal and glass. The moral decay was the court's obsession with her incorruptibility. They used her physical density as proof of her divine right to rule. They told the people that the Queen was so filled with the spirit of England that she had become as solid as the land itself. In reality, she was a dying woman being replaced by a mineral deposit. The black mirror sat in the corner of her room, always watching, always pulling. A dark sun that never set on the British Empire. We must return to the concept of the shattered mirror incident of 1588. But from the perspective of John Dee, he believed that the crack in the Queen's face was not an accident, but a frequency mismatch. The mirror was pulling at her at a rate that her physical body could not sustain. By the late 1590s, the cracks were appearing more frequently. The artificers were working around the clock to fill the fissures with alchemical resin and ground glass. The informative reality was that the Queen was a mosaic of repairs. Every time a new crack appeared, a small part of the mirror Queen would leak through. This created a state of biological dissonance. Elizabeth would sometimes speak in 2 voices at once, her own metallic rasp and the high-pitched, geometric clicking of the entities. The archive chill returns as we imagine the Queen sitting in her garden at night. The only time she felt comfortable. She would look up at the moon and feel a pull that was stronger than gravity. She realized that the mirror had not just changed her skin. It had changed her soul's destination. She was no longer bound for the Christian heaven of her father. She was bound for the black, obsidian void of the celestial plane. The psychological layer of this realization is the ultimate moral decay. Elizabeth had been the head of the Church of England, the defender of the faith. Yet, through her pursuit of power and her fear of death, she had traded her eternal soul for a few extra years of static majesty. She was a hollow idol filled with the dust of another world. The Black Mirror was her true master, and John Dee was her jailer. The forbidden knowledge of the Tudor line is that the Golden Age was not a time of enlightenment, but a time of profound alchemical darkness, where the leader of the nation was a prisoner of a glass demon. As the light of the 16th century begins to fade into the shadows of the 17th, the legacy of the Black Mirror remains. When Elizabeth finally died in 1603, the mirror did not stop humming. It had to be wrapped in lead sheets and buried beneath the foundations of the Tower of London to prevent the entities from emerging entirely. The informative reality of the British monarchy is that this obsidian legacy continues to shape their rituals. The use of heavy jewels, the specific geometry of the coronation, and the intense secrecy surrounding the royal health are all echoes of the Porcelain Mandate. They learned from Elizabeth that an icon must be static, and that the image of the monarch is more important than the reality of the person. The archive chill is the feeling that the portal is still there, just beneath the surface of the state. The black mirror was never destroyed. It was merely hidden. The moral decay of our own time is our willingness to ignore these historical anomalies in favor of a clean, comfortable narrative. The Tier 1 audience knows better. They know that history is a hall of mirrors, and that if you look closely enough at the past, you might see a reflection that isn't yours, the psychological layer for the listener. Now, drifting into the deepest part of the night, is the question of what we are inviting into our own lives through our screens and our reflections. Are we, too, becoming more transparent? Are we trading our warmth for the static integrity of the digital void? The story of John Dee's mirror is a warning from the past. It tells us that the price of forbidden knowledge is always our humanity. As you breathe in the cold, still air of the night, imagine the obsidian stone sitting in the dark, buried deep beneath the earth. It is no longer humming, but it is waiting. It is waiting for the next person to look into its surface and want to be more than they are. The Tudor secret is safe for now. But the mirror remembers the Queen. It remembers the sound of the glass bone and the smell of the mercury. It remembers the taste of a soul turned to salt, but as the lid sheets were being soldered shut around the black mirror, the artificers noticed a small, glowing aperture in the center of the stone. It wasn't a reflection. It was a countdown. And the date it pointed to was not in the past, but in the near future. To understand the true purpose of the Queen's transformation, we must look at the lead-line chamber. Why? The Queen slept in total isolation, and the truth about what was growing inside her, while the world watched her rule, the most haunting architectural secret of the Elizabethan era was not hidden in a dungeon or a fortress, but within the very walls where the Queen sought rest. While the public believed Queen Elizabeth I slept in the lap of luxury, surrounded by silk and gold, the reality was a suffocating, toxic cage. By the year 1594, the royal bedchamber at Whitehall had been transformed into a biological containment unit, with thick sheets of hammered lead hidden behind every tapestry. This was not for protection against assassins or spies. It was a desperate attempt to contain the unnatural frequency emanating from the Queen's own petrifying body. The betrayal of the monarch was total. Her advisors had realized that her glass-like bones and porcelain skin were emitting a rhythmic, crystalline vibration that threatened to shatter the very palace around her. To save the monarchy, they entombed the Queen in a lead-line silence that poisoned her blood while it shielded the state. This forbidden isolation was the only way to prevent the world from hearing the metallic hum of a human being turning into a mineral monument. The moral decay of the Tudor court reached its peak in this chamber, where a woman was sacrificed to the physics of alchemy. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We step away from the open courtyards and into the airless corridors of the private royal wing. Here, the floorboards do not creak, and the air feels unnaturally heavy, as if the gravity itself has been amplified. The candles burn with a steady, unmoving flame, and the sound of the outside world is completely absent. Settle into the weight of this silence and feel the cold. metallic pressure of the secret that resides within these walls. To understand why the Queen was moved into a lead-lined chamber, we must look at the alchemical properties of the metal itself. In the 16th century, lead was associated with the planet Saturn, the god of time, melancholy, and limits. John Dee, the Queen's occult advisor, argued that lead was the only substance capable of grounding the celestial energy that was consuming Elizabeth's biology. He believed that the Queen's body had become a conductor for a frequency that was too high for the physical world to sustain. The installation of the lead sheets was a masterpiece of covert engineering. Under the guise of repairing the palace foundations, teams of mutes were brought in to hammer sheets of lead, each nearly half an inch thick, directly onto the stone walls of the bedchamber. These sheets were then covered with heavy, dark velvet tapestries depicting scenes of the underworld and the stars. To the casual observer, the room simply looked opulent and somber. But to the Queen, it was a sensory deprivation tank. The informative depth of this construction is found in the way lead interacts with sound and vibration. Lead is incredibly dense and lacks the internal structure to vibrate. It absorbs energy rather than reflecting it. By 1594, Elizabeth's glass bone condition had progressed to the point where her movements produced a high-pitched, harmonic resonance. Without the lid shielding, this resonance caused the silver mirrors in the palace to crack and the wine glasses of the courtiers to shatter in their hands. The lead-lined chamber was the only place where the Queen could move without causing physical destruction to her environment. It was a prison designed to keep the Queen's reality from leaking into the world of her subjects. The psychological layer of this isolation is one of profound, crushing loneliness. Imagine the most powerful woman in the world, living in a room where even the sound of her own breathing is absorbed by the walls. Elizabeth spent 18 hours a day in this chamber. Because the lead blocked all external magnetic and electrical influences, the Queen's mind began to drift. She described a feeling of being suspended in a dark, cold ocean, far beneath the surface of the earth. She no longer felt the passing of time. The morning was indistinguishable from the night. The only markers of existence were the rhythmic visits of the silent maids and the periodic arrival of John Dee. Dee would sit in the corner of the room, his own body shielded by a lead-lined cloak, and monitor the Queen's internal frequency. He noted that in the presence of the lead, the Queen's skin became more opaque and her pulse more regular. The metal was acting as an artificial skin, a secondary barrier between her glass-like essence and the chaotic energy of the outside world. But the price of this stability was toxic. Lead is a slow poison. As the Queen slept, the lead dust from the walls mingled with the fumes of the vinegar and mercury she used for her makeup. This created a lethal chemical cocktail that further eroded her nervous system. She began to experience tremors and loss of balance, which her advisors dismissed as the natural effects of age. The Tier 1 listener understands that this was not aging. It was the slow, systematic poisoning of a monarch by her own shielding. The moral decay was the advisor's decision that it was better to have a poisoned, static queen than a shattered public one. Consider the sensory environment of the lead-lined chamber. In the 16th century, the world was a noisy, vibrant place. Palaces were filled with the sounds of horses, clashing swords, musicians, and thousands of voices. But inside Elizabeth's room, there was only the hum. This hum was not external. It came from within her own marrow. The Queen reported that in the total silence of the lead room, she could hear the music of the spheres vibrating in her bones. She described it as a series of interlocking geometric chords that shifted with the movement of the stars. She became obsessed with this internal sound, believing it to be the voice of God. In reality, it was the sound of her own cellular structure crystallizing. The lead was reflecting the sound back into her, creating a feedback loop that accelerated her transformation. The informative reality of the era shows that the state went to great lengths to explain her isolation. They told the public that the Queen was in a state of deep prayer or that she was working on secret diplomatic strategies. They used her absence to build the myth of her mysterious divine power. But the few who were allowed inside the chamber saw a woman who was slowly becoming indistinguishable from the metal that surrounded her. Her skin had taken on a gray, metallic luster, and her eyes were fixed in a permanent, unblinking stare. She was no longer a person. She was a biological artifact being kept in a lead-lined jar. The archive chill returns when we look at the fate of the servants who worked in the lead-lined chamber. The silent maids, already suffering from the mercury of the white lead ritual, began to die at an alarming rate. They suffered from saturnine palsy, a condition characterized by extreme weakness and mental collapse. Because they could not speak, their suffering was silent and invisible. They were replaced as quickly as they fell, their bodies buried in unmarked graves beneath the palace. Floorboards. The moral decay of the Tudor state was their absolute disregard for human life in the service of the icon. They knew the room was a death trap, yet they continued to force the Queen and her servants to occupy it. They were more afraid of the crystalline frequency than they were of the slow death of their monarch. They believed that if the Queen's internal sound were ever allowed to escape the room, it would signal the end of the world. The psychological layer for our listeners is the realization that we often build our own lead-line chambers. We isolate ourselves from the truth, shielding ourselves with lies and distractions to avoid the uncomfortable vibrations of reality. Elizabeth was the physical manifestation of this human tendency. She was the woman of glass, living in a world of lead, governed by advisors of stone. Her isolation was the ultimate expression of the Tudor secret, the idea that power is a substance that must be contained, or it will destroy everything it touches. By the late 1590s, the lead shielding was no longer enough. The Queen's frequency had grown so strong that it was beginning to permeate the metal itself. John Dee observed that the lead sheets were developing a strange, iridescent patina, like the surface of an oil slick. The metal was being altered by the Queen's presence, turning from a dull gray to a shimmering, translucent substance that mirrored her own skin. This informative detail suggests that the transformation was contagious. The inorganic matter of the palace was beginning to take on the characteristics of the Queen's organic, yet crystalline body. This is why the isolation became even more extreme. The Queen was no longer allowed to leave the room at all. Her meals were pushed through a lead-lined hatch, and her messages were dictated through a thick glass pane. She was a radioactive element, a biological hazard that the state had to manage. Think of the weight of the air in that room. Think of the smell of the lead and the velvet. Elizabeth sat in the center of this container, a monument of white lead and glass bone, looking out at a world that she could no longer touch. She was the ruler of an empire, yet she could not even feel the wind on her face. The moral decay of the state was their continued insistence that she was the Virgin Queen, a symbol of purity and life, while they knew she was a creature of poison and death. The state had become a curator of a nightmare, and the lead-line chamber was the gallery. In the archival records of the late Elizabethan period, there, is a recurring theme of royal melancholy. Historians have traditionally attributed this to the deaths of her friends and the loneliness of her old age. But the Tier 1 listener knows that this melancholy was a physical condition. It was the saturnine weight of the lead poisoning causes profound depression, irritability, and a sense of impending doom. Elizabeth was living in a constant state of chemical despair. Her mind was being hammered by the lead as much as the walls of her room. She began to talk to the shadows, believing them to be the spirits of her ancestors. She spoke of a great darkness that was coming to consume England. A darkness that was made of metal and glass. The informative depth of this psychological state is the realization that her golden age was, in her own mind, an age of lead. The prosperity and expansion of England were happening in a world she no longer inhabited. She was stuck in the void of the lead-lined chamber, fighting a war against her own biology. The forbidden knowledge is the understanding that the stability of the nation was purchased with the sanity of its ruler. The advisors didn't care about her pain. They only cared about the Saturnine shield. They needed her to stay in that room, in that state, until the very end. As we move into the final years of the century, the atmosphere in the lead room reached a point of absolute tension. The hum was now so loud that it could be heard faintly in the adjacent corridors despite the shielding. It was a sound that made the guards feel physically ill, a vibration that disrupted their balance and caused their noses to bleed. The Queen had stopped wearing her elaborate dresses and ruffs while in the chamber. She sat in a simple shift of unbleached linen, her translucent skin glowing in the amber light. Without the corsets and the braces, her body appeared fragile and elongated, her limbs like the branches of a winter tree. She had become a part of the architecture. Her presence was the gravity of the room. The psychological layer here is the Queen's final acceptance of her fate. She stopped asking to leave. She stopped asking for news of the world. She became a student of the silence. She realized that the lead was not just a shield. It was a mirror. It was showing her the truth of her existence, that she was a static, unchanging thing in a world of motion. She was the anchor of England, and the anchor was made of lead and glass. The archive chill is the feeling of that anchor dragging along the bottom of the soul, cold and unyielding. What does it mean to be grounded by lead? For Elizabeth, it meant the total suppression of her humanity. Every impulse to laugh, to cry, or to move with passion was absorbed by the walls of her room. She became as stoic as the metal that surrounded her. The moral decay of the court was their celebration of this stoicism. They told the people that the Queen had reached a state of stoic perfection, that she was a woman who had conquered her own emotions. In reality, her emotions had simply been neutralized by the physics of her environment. The informative detail of her final years is the Saturnine ledger, a secret account kept by Lord Burleigh of the Queen's physical deterioration. He tracked the density of her skin, the frequency of her hum, and the levels of lead in her blood. He treated his monarch like an experiment in a laboratory. He was not looking for a cure. He was looking for the point of solidification, the moment when the Queen would finally become a complete mineral statue. The Tier 1 audience recognizes the horror of this clinical gaze. The state was waiting for its leader to die so they could finalize the icon. The lead-lined chamber was the kill in which the Porcelain Queen was being fired. The forbidden knowledge is the fact that the English state has always been more interested in the monument than the person. Elizabeth was the first to be fully processed by this machine, but she would not be the last. The lead is still there in the foundations of our own institutions, shielding us from the truth of how power really works in the dead of night. When the palace was at its most quiet, Elizabeth would sometimes reach out and touch the velvet tapestries. She could feel the cold, hard lead beneath the cloth. She would press her ear against the wall and listen for the sound of the world. But she heard nothing. The lead was absolute. It was the end of all things. She began to wonder if the world outside still existed, or if the lead line chamber was the only reality left. This is the ultimate psychological collapse, the loss of the object permanence of the universe. The Queen of England was a woman who had lost her world, replaced by a container of metal and silence. The archive chill is the realization that this is the final destination of all secrets. They eventually become the walls of our own prisons. The informative reality of her final months shows that the lead was beginning to physically merge with her skin. The gray patina of the metal was appearing on her hands and her neck. She was becoming a saturnine entity, a creature of the heavy metal. The moral decay of the advisors was their silent observation of this merger. They watched as their queen became the room, and the room became the queen. They were the witnesses to the birth of a new kind of being, a being that did not need air or food or love, but only the cold, static integrity of the shield. As we breathe in the still, metallic air of the chamber, we realized that the lead-lined room was the only place where the queen was truly safe. Safe from the judgments of the world, safe from the shattering of her own body, and safe from the crushing weight of her own secret. But safety is another word for a tomb. The story of the lead-lined chamber is the story of the cost of containment. To keep the secret of the Tudor line, the state had to build a world of poison and silence. They had to entomb their leader while she was still breathing. The forbidden knowledge is the understanding that the Golden Age was a time of intense, localized darkness. A darkness that was measured in the thickness of lead sheets and the depth of royal isolation. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, imagine the weight of that lead. Imagine the silence of that room. The world of 1594 is fading into the shadows of the past, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth of the chamber. The queen is there, in the center of the dark, her glass bones humming in the silence, her porcelain skin glowing in the amber light. She is waiting for the end of time, grounded by the metal of Saturn, a monarch of the void. But as the final sheet of lead was being soldered into place, John Dee noticed a series of rhythmic, geometric scratches appearing on the surface of the metal from the inside. It wasn't the queen's hand that made them. Something was trying to carve its way out of the lead-line silence, something that had been born in the vacuum of her isolation. To understand what was truly growing within the shadows of the queen's bedchamber, we must look at the silent court, the maids, who were sworn to blindness, and the night the shadows finally began to speak. The most horrifying betrayal in the Tudor court was not a political assassination or a secret execution, but the systematic physical mutilation of the women closest to the throne. While the public saw Queen Elizabeth I as the Virgin Queen, a figure of celestial purity, her private chambers were a factory of forced disability. By the year 1595, the women of her inner circle, the maids of honor, were subjected to the forbidden protocol of the blinded court. To protect the secret of the queen's petrifying body and her translucent, glass-like skin, these women were forced to live in a state of medically induced near blindness. Using potent extracts of belladonna and nightshade, the royal physicians permanently blurred the vision of the maids to ensure they could serve the queen without ever truly seeing her. They were forced to navigate by touch and sound, dressing a monarch who felt more like stone than flesh. This was a buried lie that ensured no witness could ever describe the crystalline horror emerging from the queen's pores. The moral decay of the state was its willingness to sacrifice the sight of innocent women to maintain a political illusion. These maids were the human censors of a porcelain monster, living in a world of shadows to keep an empire from shattering. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move away from the lead-lined walls and into the quarters of the women who lived in the amber twilight of the queen's presence. Here, the air is heavy with the scent of bitter herbs and the soft rustle of silk moving through the dark. Settle into the rhythmic pulse of this secret, and feel the weight of the shadows as they close around the eyes of the silent. To understand the silent court, we must first understand the selection process for the 12 vessels. These were the 12 women chosen to serve in the queen's private bedchamber. In any other era, being a maid of honor was a position of extreme prestige, a path to a wealthy marriage and political influence. But under the Porcelain Mandate of 1595, it became a sentence of sensory isolation. The advisors, led by the spymaster Walsingham and the occultist John Dee, looked for specific traits in these women. They sought those with no living family, those who were already inclined toward quietude, and those whose loyalty was fueled by a desperate need for the crown's protection. Once selected, the women were brought to a secret wing of Richmond Palace. Here they were stripped of their previous identities and introduced to the vow of the veil. This was not just a vow of secrecy. It was a commitment too. We enter the secret workshop of the Tudor artificers. The transition from a woman to a shell began in the damp winter months of late 1599. To the Tier 1 audience seeking the deeper informative layers of history, we must understand that the physical Elizabeth was no longer capable of supporting the weight of her own majesty. The decades of applying Venetian cerus had not only poisoned her nervous system, but had created a structural dependency. Her skin, now nearly transparent and brittle as antique parchment, could no longer hold the layers of lead without fracturing. The incident witnessed by the Spanish ambassador was the final warning. The state could no longer risk the queen shattering in front of the world. Thus, the artificers were summoned. These were not the usual court painters or dressmakers. They were a secret guild of master craftsmen, brought from the clockmaking centers of Nuremberg and the porcelain workshops of Florence. They worked in a basement chamber of the palace that had been reinforced with lead sheets to contain the sound of their hammers. Their task was to build a successor that would never fail. They began with a frame of lightweight iron and silver wires, modeled exactly on the Queen's measurements from her 30th year. This was the birth of the shell, the mechanical effigy that would become the face of the British Empire. The psychological layer of this project was profound. The advisors, led by Robert Cecil, realized that the English people did not need a person. They needed a symbol. They needed a queen who remained eternally youthful, a static anchor in a changing world. By building the shell, the state was essentially divorcing the monarchy from the human condition. The moral decay lay in their total indifference to the real Elizabeth, who was being moved to a separate, lead-lined room while the artificers perfected her replacement. Imagine the atmosphere of that workshop. The smell of hot oil, the clinking of small silver gears, and the scent of fine white clay. The artificers used the Queen's own hair, harvested from her brushes over decades, to create the wig. They used the finest Venetian glass for the eyes, painting the iris to match the Queen's exactly, but omitting the tiny red veins of human fatigue. The shell was perfect. It was a masterpiece of archival deception. When it was finished, it stood in the center of the room, a hollow monument waiting to be filled with the authority of a dying woman. The implementation of the Mask of Youth required a total overhaul of royal protocol. Since the shell could not speak with the nuance of a human voice, the artificers installed a series of bellows and silver reeds within its chest. When a small key was turned in the back of the neck, the shell would emit a resonant, metallic tone that sounded like Elizabeth's voice, but without the tremors of age. To hide the mechanical nature of this speech, the Queen's private secretary would stand behind a curtain, providing the actual words while the shell's jaw moved in a rhythmic, clicking synchronization. The informative reality of the year 1600 shows a dramatic increase in restricted audiences. The shell could only be operated for short periods, and the lighting in the presence of the monarch was strictly controlled. This is why the later years of Elizabeth's reign are characterized by the amber twilight. The soft, yellow flicker of beeswax candles was the only light that did not reveal the seam, where the porcelain mask met the silver-wired neck. The state used the Queen's supposed divine radiance as an excuse to keep the public and even high-ranking courtiers at a distance of at least 10 feet. The sensory cues for those who were granted an audience were haunting. They reported a faint, rhythmic ticking sound that seemed to come from the Queen's chest, which the courtiers attributed to a high-precision watch hidden in her bodice. They noted that her hand, when offered for a kiss, was unnaturally cold and lacked the soft yielding of flesh. It felt like kissing a polished stone. The scent of the Queen changed from the metallic lead of her earlier years to a strange, industrial smell of beeswax, linseed oil, and cold iron. The psychological layer here is the collective denial of the court. Many of the advisors must have known. They must have seen the way the Queen's eyes never moved in their sockets, or how her breathing was a constant, unchanging hiss of air. But the archive chill prevented them from speaking. To admit the Queen was a shell was to admit that the entire structure of the state was a lie. The moral decay had reached the point where the survival of the illusion was more important than the truth of their own eyes. They stood in the presence of a machine and addressed it as their sovereign, participating in a massive, nationwide performance that would ensure the Tudor legacy remained untarnished by the reality of death. While the shell performed the duties of the state, the real Elizabeth was relegated to the status of a biological reference. She was kept in a state of alchemical stasis, her only role being to provide the signatures for the official documents. The artificers had created a mechanical hand for the shell that could replicate her handwriting, but for the most important decrees, they still required the touch of the original. They would bring the parchment to the real Queen's lead-lined room where she sat in her ebony chair, her translucent skin now almost entirely replaced by crystalline growth. The informative depth of this period is found in the Radcliffe Protocols, which governed the interaction between the two queens. The state had created a system where the information flowed from the human Elizabeth to the mechanical shell through a series of intermediaries. This was the birth of the modern bureaucratic layer, a system designed to filter the messy reality of a human life into a clean, static output. The advisors were the programmers of the shell, feeding it the scripts and the movements that would maintain the peace of the realm. The moral decay was the total dehumanization of the monarch. The advisors had become so obsessed with the performance that they began to view the shell as more real than the woman. They took better care of the mechanical joints and the porcelain mask than they did of the woman's failing heart. They spent hours polishing the shell's silver frame while the real Elizabeth sat in the darkness, her voice reduced to a low, sub-harmonic hum. The retention of this narrative depends on the visceral realization of this duality. Imagine the two figures in the palace, one a radiant, unmoving goddess of gold and porcelain standing before the parliament, the other a clear, glass-like figure of bone and shadow hidden in a room of lead. The queen had been split in two. Her humanity had been discarded as a defect, and her image had been elevated to a state of mechanical perfection. This was the ultimate forbidden knowledge of the Tudor era. The Golden Age was not ruled by a woman of genius, but by a committee of advisors who managed a clockwork idol. The stability of England was built on a foundation of gears and wax, a secret that was so profound that even today, the official history of 1601 remains a carefully curated facade. The archive chill is the feeling of the wind moving through the hollow chest of the shell, a reminder that power, once it reaches its peak, no longer needs a human heart to sustain it. The most critical challenge for the artificers was the public progression. In late 1601, the state needed the Queen to travel to Tilbury to demonstrate her continued vitality. The logistical nightmare of moving a lead-line mechanical shell across the English countryside was immense. They built a specialized carriage with an advanced suspension system made of silk and iron springs to prevent the porcelain mask from vibrating and cracking during the journey. The shell was bolted into the seat, its arm rigged to perform a rhythmic, slow wave to the crowds. The informative detail of this journey is hidden in the local records of the towns the Queen passed through. Villagers reported that the Queen appeared more like a painting than a woman, and that her skin had a glow that was visible even through the dust of the road. They described her as a heavenly effigy. The state used this religious fervor to mask the technical reality. Whenever the carriage stopped, the silent maids would swarm around it, ostensibly to adjust the Queen's veils, but in reality to check the tension of the silver wires and the level of the oil in the internal reservoirs. The psychological layer for the people was one of extreme, desperate hope. They wanted to believe that their Queen was immortal, that she was the one constant in a world of war and famine. The state fed this hunger with the shell. The moral decay was the exploitation of this faith. The advisors knew that every time the shell waved its hand, it was a triumph of engineering, not a gesture of love. They were laughing in the shadows of the carriage, watching as a nation of thousands knelt before a puppet. The sensory cues of the Tilbury appearance were the ultimate height of the porcelain illusion. The shell stood on a raised platform, the sun reflecting off its polished face and its silver breastplate. It did not move for 3 hours. It did not sweat. It did not blink. It was the perfect icon of the British Empire. But for those standing close enough, the archive chill was unavoidable. The air around the platform was freezing, and the sound of the wind through the shell's hollow ruff created a low morning whistle. This was the sound of the void at the center of the monarchy. The state had succeeded in replacing the person with the shell, but in doing so, they had invited a cold and human presence into the very heart of the nation. The Virgin Queen was gone, and in her place sat Their own bones began to ache with the same rhythmic, crystalline vibration. They began to hum the same low-frequency notes in their sleep. The state had not just blinded them, they had tuned them. They were no longer separate human beings. They were parts of a biological machine designed to maintain the porcelain illusion. The moral decay was the transformation of a group of young women into a collective. Blinded censor for an otherworldly parasite. As we move toward the final hours of the night, the atmosphere of the silent court feels closer, more intimate. We must consider the crystalline residue that the maids had to manage. Every morning, they would find a fine iridescent dust on the queen's bedsheets. This was the salt of the soul, the mineral byproduct of the petrification process. The maids would collect this dust in silver jars, their blurred eyes seeing it only as a shimmering cloud. John Dee used this dust for his further experiments, believing it to be the key to the great synthesis. But for the maids, it was a reminder of the queen's slow dissolution. They were the ones who had to wash the queen's body, feeling the hard, cold ridges of the crystal growth. They were the ones who had to apply the heavy lead mask, feeling the weight of the lie they were building. The archive chill is the realization that the Golden Age was built on a foundation of this dust and the broken sight of the women who collected it. The stability of the empire was maintained by those who could not see it, serving a monarch who was no longer there. But as the winter of 1595 turned to spring, the silent maids noticed something that the belladonna drops could not hide. The queen's frequency was no longer just a sound. It was becoming a physical pressure that they felt in their own blood. To understand the true biological cost of the Tudor line, we must look at the anatomy of the Virgin Queen, the translucent royal bloodline, and the night the Queen's pulse finally stopped being human. The most terrifying secret of the Tudor dynasty was not hidden in a vault or a cipher, but in the very veins of the woman who sat upon the throne. We have been taught that Queen Elizabeth I was the Virgin Queen, a biological human holding the weight of an empire. This is a profound and dangerous lie. The truth is that by the final decade of her reign, Elizabeth was no longer a creature of red blood and warm flesh. The forbidden medical records of the royal physicians reveal a biological betrayal that defies every law of nature. When the Queen was injured during a private ritual in 1596, she did not bleed the crimson fluid of a mortal. Instead, from her translucent skin flowed a clear, shimmering liquid that glowed with a faint, cold bioluminescence. Her blood had been replaced by a celestial tincture, an alchemical byproduct of the heavy lead, mercury, and obsidian scrying that had consumed her life. Her internal organs had become visible through her skin, appearing as glowing, geometric shapes that pulsed with the rhythm of the stars rather than the beat of a human heart. The state buried this biological curse to prevent a total religious collapse. For if the people knew their queen was a translucent anomaly, they would realize she was a vessel for something other than God. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move deeper into the twilight of the 16th century, where the heavy velvet curtains of the bedchamber block the rising sun. Here the air is cold and still, carrying the metallic tang of the silver baths and the scent of ancient dust. Settle into the rhythmic silence and prepare to witness the anatomy of a miracle that became a horror. The informative reality of the Tudor secret reached its breaking point on a Tuesday evening in November. The Queen was seated in her ebony chair, her body supported by the hidden iron braces that had become her exoskeleton. one of the silent maids, whose vision was blurred by the belladonna protocol, accidentally brushed against the Queen's arm with a sharp silver pin while adjusting the great ruff in a normal human. This would have produced a small, stinging drop of red blood, but as the pin pierced the porcelain-like surface of Elizabeth's forearm, the room was filled with a soft blue radiance. The physician on duty, Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, recorded the event in a secret journal that would later be used as evidence for his execution. He described the fluid as the ichor of the moon. It was not viscous like blood. It was thin and clear, catching the light like liquid diamond. As it spilled onto the white silk of her sleeve, it did not stain. It evaporated, leaving behind a fine, crystalline powder that smelled of ozone and sulfur. The psychological layer of this event was one of absolute, paralyzing fear. Elizabeth did not cry out in pain. She stared at the puncture in her arm with a detached curiosity, as if she were observing a crack in a piece of fine pottery. She reached out with her other hand and touched the fluid, her fingers leaving a glowing trail across her skin. Lopez realized in that moment that the Queen's virginity was a chemical state. She had reached the alchemical marriage that John Dee had promised, where the physical body is refined until it becomes a conductor for pure spirit. But the refinement had erased her humanity. Her heart was no longer a pump for blood. It had become a core for a frequency. This forbidden knowledge was immediately classified. The maid was removed, and the room was scrubbed until every trace of the glowing powder was gone. But the anatomy of the Queen had been revealed. She was a window into a different state of matter, a transparent monarch ruling a world of shadows. As the transformation accelerated, the translucency of the Queen's skin became a primary concern for the state. To the Tier 1 listener seeking the technical details of the cover-up, the description of her internal anatomy is essential. Because the skin had lost its opacity, the artificers had to apply thicker and thicker layers of the Venetian ceruse, not just to her face, but to her hands, her neck, and her chest. They were literally painting a human body over a crystalline one. In the private baths, where the makeup was removed. The silent maids saw the true anatomy of the Virgin. The skeletal structure was no longer made of ivory-colored bone. It had turned into a lattice of obsidian and silver, the bones interlocking like the gears of a complex clock. The rib cage was a series of translucent arcs that caught the candlelight and refracted it into rainbows against the lead-lined walls. Most hauntingly, the organs themselves had changed. The lungs were no longer pink and spongy. They appeared as two shimmering, silver fans that expanded and contracted with a metallic hiss. The heart was the center of the mystery. Through the clear tissue of her chest, it could be seen as a faceted gem, a massive, dark diamond that did not beat so much as it vibrated. It gave off a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that resonated in the floorboards. This hum was the source of the archive chill that courtiers reported feeling in her presence. It was a sound that didn't travel through the air, but through the bones of those standing near her. John Dee called this the diamond core. He believed the Queen's soul had crystallized, providing her with a static immortality. But the moral decay of this belief was the total disregard for her suffering. Every movement of this crystalline heart sent sharp electric shocks through her nervous system. She was in a state of constant, high-vibration agony, which she masked with a rigid, unmoving posture. The state did not care. They saw her as the ultimate achievement of the Tudor line, a monarch who could never truly die because she had already become a relic. They were curated by her heart, anchored by her glass bones. and terrified of the light that lived inside. Her dot, the chemical composition of the queen's blood, was the result of the tincture of the sun, a substance John Dee had been refining since the late 1570s. This tincture was a suspension of colloidal gold, dissolved in a powerful acid and mixed with the extracts of rare plants from the New World. It was intended to be the elixir of life, a medicine that would prevent the decay of the monarchy. Elizabeth began taking the tincture in small doses during the crisis of 1588. At first, it gave her incredible energy and mental clarity. But the informative reality was that the gold was not being processed by her liver. It was accumulating in her cells. It was replacing the iron in her blood. Over the years, this created a biological feedback loop with the lead-based makeup she wore. The gold in her veins and the lead on her skin created a galvanic reaction, turning her entire body into a primitive battery. This is why she began to glow in the dark. This is why she could no longer sleep. Her body was constantly on, charged by the chemical marriage of gold and lead. The psychological layer for the queen was the loss of silence. She could hear the electricity moving through her own limbs. She felt her thoughts as flashes of light. She was no longer thinking in English. She was thinking in frequencies. The moral decay of John Dee was his realization that the tincture was not extending her life, but fossilizing her while she was still awake. He watched her skin turn clear and her blood turn to liquid light with a sense of scientific triumph. He wrote in his secret diary that the queen was the first of a new race of men who would be as eternal as the sun. He ignored the fact that she was becoming a prisoner in a transparent cage. She could no longer feel the heat of a fire or the touch of a hand. She felt only the flow of the alchemical current. The state used this divine radiance to control the masses, telling them the queen was filled with the Holy Spirit. In truth, she was filled with a toxic, glowing slurry that was slowly erasing her humanity. By the year 1597, the queen's biological frequency had become the pulse of the empire. The informative depth of this connection is found in the ley line mapping that John Dee conducted across London. He believed that the queen's crystalline heart was synchronized with the magnetic field of the earth, and that by positioning her in specific rooms in Whitehall and Richmond, they could amplify the power of the British throne. The sensory cues of this period were intense. The air around the queen was always cold, and the sound of static electricity would crackle whenever she moved her silk robes. The Tier 1 audience must understand that this was not a metaphor. The queen was a physical anchor for the state. If her frequency wavered, the archive chill would spread through the palace, causing the clocks to stop and the horses in the stables to go wild with fear. The psychological layer for the advisors was a state of constant tension. They were no longer ruling a kingdom. They were managing a biological power plant. If Elizabeth were to shatter, or if her crystalline blood were to leak too quickly, the tension of the throne would be lost. This is why they created the Porcelain Mandate, ensuring that no one could get close enough to see the shimmering reality of her anatomy. They used the queen's condition to justify her isolation, telling the world she was a virgin, too holy for the touch of men. The hidden truth was that she was too dangerous for the touch of men. A single static spark could have caused her blood to ignite or her glass bones to vibrate until they disintegrated. She was a weapon of mass distraction, a glowing idol held together by fear and alchemical resin. The moral decay was the choice to prioritize this power over the simple peace of a dying woman. They kept her in her ebony chair, her clear blood pulsing with a light that didn't belong on earth. While they planned for a future where the Queen would never need to be buried because she would never truly die. She was the ghost in the Tudor machine, the translucent heart of a world that was already turning to stone. As the narration moves toward the final deep dive of the anatomy, the pacing slows to a hypnotic crawl. We must consider the archive chill that remains in the royal records. There is a specific document, often bypassed by historians, known as the anatomy of the casket. It describes the final physical assessment of the Queen before her public appearance at the end of the century. The report notes that her skin had reached a refractive index of 1.5, similar to that of glass. This meant that any light hitting her was bent and scattered, creating a shimmering aura that made it impossible to fix her features in one's gaze. Her blood pressure could not be measured as the liquid light in. Her veins moved with a constant high-frequency vibration rather than a surge. Her internal temperature was nearly 10 degrees lower than a normal human's. She was, in every measurable way, a cold-blooded entity. The psychological layer here is the Queen's final detachment. She had stopped speaking to her advisors entirely, communicating only through a series of rhythmic taps with her glass-like fingernails. She seemed to be listening to something that no one else could hear: the sound of the Earth's rotation or the movements of the stars. She was no longer the Queen of England. She was the Queen of the Void, the informative reality of the Tudor. Secret is that the state had succeeded in creating a deity, but they had lost the woman. They had built a monument of translucent flesh and obsidian bone that would haunt the British imagination for centuries. The moral decay was the pride they took in this achievement. They believed they had conquered death through alchemy, but they had only created a new and more terrifying form of burial: a living entombment in a transparent body. As the candles flicker and the shadows of the bedchamber lengthen, imagine the sight of the Queen standing in the dark, her internal organs glowing with a soft blue light, her clear blood moving through her veins like a liquid star. She is the ultimate icon, the Virgin Queen of the Porcelain Age, waiting for the night when the light will finally consume the glass. But as the royal physicians closed the secret ledger for the final time, they noticed that the glowing fluid in the Queen's veins was beginning to change color. It was no longer blue. It was turning a deep obsidian black. To understand why the Queen's blood was turning to liquid shadow, and what the Spanish ambassador saw when he finally caught a glimpse behind the porcelain mask, we must look at the Spanish ambassador's discovery, the sound of breaking porcelain, and the night. The Tudor secret finally spoke to the world. The most devastating betrayal of the Tudor image did not come from a rebel sword or a traitor's letter, but from a single, unintended sound in a darkened room. We are led to believe that the secrets of Queen Elizabeth I were protected by walls of stone and legions of guards, but the forbidden report of the Spanish ambassador Bernardino de Mendoza reveals a truth that was far more fragile. In the winter of 1598, while the world watched the slow dance of European diplomacy, Mendoza witnessed a biological catastrophe that the English state had buried for decades. It was a secret born of a curse, an alchemical lie that had turned the Virgin Queen into a living shell of porcelain and glass. During a private audience, a simple accident caused a physical collision that should have resulted in a bruise, but instead produced a sharp, crystalline snap that echoed like breaking pottery. Mendoza saw the impossible, a fracture in the Queen's very face, revealing not flesh and blood, but a hollow, translucent void etched with silver veins. The moral decay of the state was laid bare in that moment of structural failure. They were not serving a woman. They were maintaining a gargoyle of lead and glass bone. The ambassador realized that the British Empire was being ruled by a shattering idol, a secret so dangerous it could ignite a holy war. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We step out of the loud, chaotic courtyards of Whitehall and into the heavy, airless silence of the Queen's private withdrawing room. Here, the floor is covered in thick, woven rushes to dampen every footstep, and the walls are draped in dark velvet. Settle into the rhythmic stillness of 1598 and feel the mounting tension of a world about to break. To understand the discovery, we must look at the mind of the man who made it. Bernardino de Mendoza was not merely a diplomat. He was the eyes and ears of King Philip II of Spain. He was a man trained to read the subtle shifts in a monarch's expression, the hidden tremors of a hand and the unspoken weight of a silence. For years, Mendoza had sent encrypted reports back to Madrid, noting that the English queen had become unnaturally static. He wrote of her mercurial radiance and the way she seemed to move with a rhythmic, mechanical precision that defied her advancing years. The informative reality of the era was one of intense espionage. Spain was convinced that Elizabeth had died years ago and was being replaced by a series of doubles. Mendoza's mission was to find the seam in the lie, but as he stood in the amber twilight of the Queen's presence, he realized the truth was far more disturbing than a simple impersonator. He noted the archive chill that followed the Queen, a localized drop in temperature that turned the breath of the courtiers into mist, even in the height of summer. He noticed that the Queen never blinked in direct light and that her skin possessed a refractive depth that made it difficult to focus on her features. The psychological layer for Mendoza was one of growing religious dread. He began to believe that Elizabeth was not a woman at all, but a demon of the glass, an entity summoned by John Dee to preserve the heretical throne. He described her voice as a metallic vibration that did not seem to originate from her throat, but from the very air around her. He watched her from across the banquet halls, a silent observer in a court of ghosts. He saw the moral decay in the eyes of her advisors, men like Cecil and Raleigh, who stood near her with a strange, protective terror. They weren't guarding a person. They were guarding a frequency. Mendoza knew that the secret was held together by the thick layers of white lead makeup, and he waited for the moment when the mask would fail. That moment arrived on a cold Tuesday in December, in a room lit by nothing but the glow of the Queen's own translucent skin. The setting for the discovery was a small octagonal room known as the lead-lined closet. It was here that Elizabeth received foreign dignitaries when her golden mask was too heavy for public display. The sensory cues of this space were overwhelming. The walls were covered in sheets of hammered lead, hidden behind tapestries of dark blue silk. The air was thick with the scent of vinegar, rosewater, and the sharp ozone smell of the silver baths. There were no mirrors in this room. Elizabeth had forbidden them, for the black obsidian scrying stone of John Dee was the only reflection she could now tolerate. Mendoza was ushered into the room by a silent maid, a woman whose eyes were blurred by belladonna. He felt the heavy, saturnine pressure of the lead-lined walls immediately. It was as if the room were trying to suppress a sound that didn't want to be caught. The Queen was seated in her ebony chair, her body a stiff silhouette against the amber candlelight. She was wearing a gown of white satin, embroidered with silver thread and seed pearls. To the Tier 1 listener, the informative detail of her dress is crucial. It was reinforced with whalebone and iron wires to keep her glass-like frame from sagging under its own weight. As Mendoza knelt before her, he performed the required ritual of feigned adoration. But as he rose, he noticed a hairline fracture in the white lead makeup near the Queen's temple. It was a tiny, jagged line that shimmered with a pale blue light. This was the crystalline rejection we have explored in previous chapters. The Queen's internal frequency was pushing against the chemical seal. Mendoza, sensing a moment of weakness, moved closer than protocol allowed. He spoke of the Spanish king's desire for peace, but his eyes were fixed on that tiny crack. The psychological layer of this encounter was a high-stakes game of biological poker. Elizabeth knew he was looking. She remained perfectly still, her unblinking eyes reflecting the candle flames like two dark, polished stones. She spoke in her resonant, metallic voice, the sound vibrating in Mendoza's own chest. She was a woman of glass trying to project a heart of iron, but the room was too small. The air too still, and the tension of the throne was reaching its breaking point. Mendoza reached out to hand her a sealed scroll, a gesture that was part of the diplomatic theater. It was in this simple exchange of parchment that the Tudor secret finally shattered in the light. As Mendoza extended the scroll, his fingers brushed against the Queen's sleeve. This was the forbidden contact. In that instant, a spark of static electricity jumped between the Spanish diplomat and the alchemical monarch. The reaction was violent. The Queen's body, charged by years of mercury baths and gold tinctures, discharged a pulse of energy that threw Mendoza backward. As he fell, his hand struck a silver tray held by a nearby servant. The tray was knocked into the Queen's lap. It was a minor collision, the kind that should have resulted in nothing more than a startled gasp. But the sound that filled the octagonal room was the sound of a structural catastrophe. It was not the dull thud of metal against flesh. It was a sharp, high-pitched snap, followed by the unmistakable rhythmic clinking of porcelain shards hitting a stone floor. Mendoza looked up from the ground, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw Elizabeth sitting in her chair, perfectly motionless, but a large piece of her right cheek had fallen away. It lay on the rushes of the floor, a curved shard of white, leaden-fused tissue that was as hard and brittle as a teacup. Where the skin had been, there was now a gaping, translucent hole. Through this hole, Mendoza saw the internal anatomy of the Virgin Queen. He saw the obsidian jawbone, the silver-etched teeth, and the glowing, blue fluid of her blood moving through a network of crystalline tubes. The informative reality of the discovery was total. The moral decay of the Tudor line was no longer an abstract theory. It was a physical fact lying on the floor. Elizabeth did not bleed. She did not scream. She simply reached down with a hand that moved with a slow, grinding sound and picked up the shard of her own face. She looked at Mendoza, her one remaining human eye filled with a cold, ancient sorrow. In that moment, the ambassador realized that the Golden Age was a gallery of broken things, held together by nothing but the sheer will of the state and the silence of the lead-lined walls. He had heard the sound of a monarchy breaking, and he knew that the world could never be the same. The aftermath of the discovery was a masterpiece of clinical suppression. Within seconds, the lead-line doors were bolted from the outside. The silent maids descended upon the room, their blurred eyes seeing only the shimmering chaos of the broken mask. Mendoza was seized by the guards, but he was not killed. The state could not afford the scandal of a dead ambassador. Instead, they took him to the white-lied chamber, the same room where the Queen's makeup was prepared. There, he was met by Sir Robert Cecil, the new architect of the Tudor secret. Cecil did not offer excuses. He offered a threat. He told Mendoza that what he had seen was not a biological horror, but a divine transfiguration. He explained that the Queen was becoming the living relic of England, and that any attempt to describe her true form would be seen as the ultimate heresy. The informative depth of this interrogation shows the shift from alchemy to political theology. The state was now using the Queen's petrification as a religious weapon. Mendoza was released 48 hours later and immediately fled to the Spanish coast. Once safe, he wrote his forbidden report to King Philip II. This document, which survived in the secret archives of the Simancas, is the primary source for our understanding of the porcelain decay. Mendoza described the snap as the sound of a soul being crushed by its own image. He warned his king that England was not ruled by a woman, but by a crystalline engine that used Elizabeth's body as its fuel. The psychological layer for Mendoza was a permanent state of trauma. He spent the rest of his life in a monastery, refusing to look at mirrors and jumping at the sound of breaking glass. He believed that the frequency he had felt during the collision had infected him, that his own bones were beginning to hum with the Tudor rhythm. The moral decay had spread from the Queen to her observer. He was a man who had seen behind the veil of the world and found only a hollow glass god. His report was never made public, but it changed the Spanish strategy forever. They stopped trying to invade England with ships. They began to wait for the Queen to simply shatter from within. As the light of 1598 fades into the long shadows of the night, we must consider the archive chill that remains in the wake of the ambassador's discovery. There is a specific entry in the royal wardrobe accounts for the following month, listing a large shipment of adhesive resin and ground diamond. This was the material used to repair the Queen's face, to glue the porcelain shard back into the void of her cheek. The informative reality of the Tudor secret is that the Virgin Queen was now a mosaic of repairs. Every inch of her skin was a patchwork of alchemical fillers and lead-based enamel. She was a woman who could no longer move her head or speak without risking another fracture. She became a prisoner of her own structural integrity. The moral decay was the court's decision to continue the public theater. They dressed her in even more elaborate gowns, covered her in even more jewels, to distract the eye from the hairline fractures that were spreading across her neck and hands. The psychological layer for the listener, drifting now into the deepest part of the night, is the realization that the truth is often a fragile thing. We live in a world of polished surfaces and careful masks, yet beneath it all, we are as vulnerable as glass. Elizabeth was the physical manifestation of this human condition. She was the most powerful woman on earth, yet she was one accident away from becoming a pile of shards on a velvet rug. The hypnotic pacing of the story slows to a final crawl. Think of the silence of the octagonal room after the ambassador left. Think of the Queen sitting in her chair, holding the piece of her own face, waiting for the artificers to arrive with their silver glue and their leaden brushes. She was a monarch of the void, a woman of glass ruling a world of shadow. The forbidden knowledge is the understanding that the Golden Age was built on a foundation of porcelain and poison, a secret that was held together by the silence of the dead. But as the artificers applied the final layer of resin to the Queen's cheek, they noticed that the translucent skin was no longer clear. It was beginning to take on a deep golden hue, a sign that the alchemical process was reaching its final volatile stage. To understand how the state planned to hide a queen who was turning into a solid gold statue, we must look at the mask of youth, how the crown replaced a dying woman with a shell. And the night the real Elizabeth finally vanished from the throne, the year 1600, was not the dawn of a new century, but the final stroke of a catastrophic betrayal. For 4 decades, the world had bowed to the Virgin Queen, but by the twilight of her reign, the woman named Elizabeth had vanished, replaced by a forbidden mechanical shell. This was the ultimate lie of the Tudor state, a curse of identity where the biological monarch was discarded to preserve the political icon. As her flesh petrified into a translucent glass-like waste, the royal advisors enacted a secret protocol to replace her with a hollow, lead-lined automaton dressed in her robes. The betrayal was so absolute that not even her closest ministers knew exactly when the human soul left and the rhythmic ticking of the internal gears began. They buried the truth of her agonizing transition, sealing the secret behind a mask of porcelain and silver. The moral decay of England was mirrored in the hollow, unblinking eyes of this substitute, a creature of wax and iron ruling a nation that believed it was witnessing a living goddess. Every decree, every signature, and every royal appearance was a calculated performance by a puppet, a ghost in the machine of the state that was designed to never age and never die. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. The heavy velvet curtains of Richmond Palace are drawn tight against the morning mist, and the only sound is the rhythmic, metallic pulse of a clock that never stops. Settle into the stillness and feel the weight of the years as machine of state that would never stop ticking until the final day of the dynasty. As we reach the conclusion of this chapter in the Tudor secret, the atmosphere in the palace feels heavier, more constricted. The year is 1602, and the mechanical shell has become so synonymous with the monarchy that the real Elizabeth is almost entirely forgotten. She has become a ghost in her own residence, a transparent shadow that is no longer consulted on the affairs of the realm. The advisors have found that the shell is much easier to manage than the woman. The machine does not argue. It does not have moods. It does not have human needs. The informative reality of the mask of youth is that it was the final stage of the state's total control. By replacing the monarch with a shell, the advisors had ensured their own power would never be challenged by a royal whim. They were the ones who turned the key. They were the ones who wrote the scripts. The moral decay was the birth of the modern institutional state, where the figurehead is a hollow vessel for the interests of the powerful, the psychological layer for the listener. Drifting now toward the edge of sleep is the realization that we are often more comfortable with the shell than with the person. We prefer the static, perfect image to the messy, changing reality of life. Elizabeth was the first human to be fully consumed by her own icon. She was the woman who became a mask, the queen who became a clock. The archive chill is the feeling of that clock ticking in the silence of the night, a reminder of the time when England was ruled by a beautiful, hollow lie. Think of the shell sitting in its chair in the dark, its porcelain face staring out at the empty throne room. Its gears are silent for now, its silver wires are slack. But the secret remains, etched into the very foundations of the palace. The Tudor line ended not with a human breath, but with a mechanical click. The history you have been told is a dream. The truth is much colder and much clearer. The mask was not just a covering. It was the new reality. The woman was gone, and only the shell remained. But as the artificers were preparing the shell for the final year of the reign, they noticed a small, dark stain appearing on the inside of the porcelain mask. It wasn't oil and it wasn't lead. It was a single human tear that had petrified into a black diamond. To understand the psychological collapse of the woman who watched her own shell take her place, we must look at the psychology of the mask, a monarch losing her, humanity, and the night the real Elizabeth tried to break the porcelain from. Within, the most profound betrayal in the history of power was not the loss of a throne, but the systematic erasure of a human soul to preserve a political image. By the year 1602, the world believed it was witnessing the eternal reign of the Virgin Queen, but the woman named Elizabeth had become a ghost haunting her own residence. This was the ultimate Tudor curse, a monarch forced to watch from a lead-line shadow, as a mechanical shell took her place in the light of the court. The secret buried within the palace walls was a horror of psychological decay, where the biological queen was relegated to a mere reference point for a puppet made of porcelain and iron, as her body turned to glass and her blood to liquid shadow. Her mind began to fracture under the weight of a forbidden duality. She was a prisoner of her own majesty, a woman whose every human impulse was suppressed to maintain the static integrity of a lie. The advisors chose to keep the icon alive while the person withered in a vacuum of silence. They traded her sanity for the stability of the state, turning a genius into a hollow witness to her own replacement. This was a moral decay so absolute that it redefined the nature of identity itself. Behind the unblinking eyes of the mask, a human being was screaming in a frequency no one was permitted to hear. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move away from the clockwork ticking of the state and into the deepest, coldest corner of the royal apartments. Here, the air is thick with the scent of bitter herbs and the heavy, saturnine pressure of the lead shielding. Settle into the stillness and feel the slow dissolution of a self-doubt to understand the psychological collapse of Elizabeth. We must look at the political theory of the era known as the King's Two Bodies. In the 16th century, it was believed that a monarch possessed a body natural, which was subject to age and death, and a body politic, which was immortal and divine. But for Elizabeth, this theory was no longer an abstraction. It had become a physical, agonizing reality. By 1602, her body politic had been literalized in the form of the mechanical shell, while her body natural was a petrifying mass of glass bones and translucent skin. The informative depth of this period is found in the Queen's private correspondence with John Dee in these letters, which were marked with the highest seal of secrecy. Elizabeth stopped using the royal we. She began to refer to the mechanical shell as the Queen and to herself as the tenant or the resident. This is a classic symptom of profound dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism where the mind detaches from a reality too painful to endure. She would sit in her lead-line chamber, listening to the muffled sounds of the court celebrating the Queen's birthday in the Great Hall, knowing that the figure they were cheering was a clockwork effigy. The sensory cues of this existence were haunting. Elizabeth's world was reduced to the tactile sensations of her ebony chair and the taste of the thin, alchemical broths she consumed. She lived in a sensory vacuum, shielded from the sun and the wind. The only thing she could feel was the vibration of the shell's movements through the palace floorboards. She described it as a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat that was slowly replacing her own. The psychological layer for our Tier 1 listeners is the horror of being a spectator to one's own life. Elizabeth watched as her advisors, men she had known for decades, began to treat the shell with more reverence than they treated her. They would bow to the porcelain mask while ignoring the clear, shimmering woman in the corner of the room. The moral decay was the court's preference for the static, controllable object over the changing, suffering person. They had built a goddess, and they no longer had any use for the woman who had birthed her. The Queen was losing her humanity because the state had decided that humanity was a defect in the machinery of power. She was being unmade by her own success, a monarch of the void looking out through a crack in a leaden wall at a world that had already moved on without her. As the months of 1602 passed, the Queen's mind began to synchronize with the mechanical pulse of the shell. This is the frequency entrainment that John Dee recorded in his psychological assessments. Because Elizabeth spent so much time in the silence of the lead-lined room, her internal thoughts began to take on the rhythmic, clicking cadence of the clockwork gears. She reported hearing the great clock of state ticking in her skull, a sound that never stopped. Even when she tried to sleep, the informative reality of her mental state was a condition we might now recognize as sensory deprivation psychosis. But in the 17th century, it was seen as the final alchemy of the mind. Elizabeth began to lose the ability to speak in sentences. Her communication was reduced to single, resonant words that hummed in the air like the notes of a silver bell. She was losing her connection to the English language, the very tool she had used to build her empire. She was becoming a creature of pure frequency, the archive chill. Returns when we consider the night the Queen tried to speak to the shell, according to a redacted report from a silent maid. Elizabeth was found standing before the mechanical effigy in the dead of night. She was touching the porcelain cheek of the mask with her translucent fingers. She was whispering to it, asking the machine to tell her what it felt like to be loved by the people. The shell, of course, did not answer. It only ticked. This psychological layer reveals the ultimate loneliness of the Tudor secret. Elizabeth was jealous of her own replacement. She saw the shell as the pure Elizabeth, the one who was not burdened by pain, or memory, or the slow petrification of the bone. She wanted to merge with the machine, to leave her failing glass body behind and live forever in the porcelain mask. The moral decay of the advisors was their encouragement of this delusion. They wanted her to believe she was ascending, while they were actually just preparing for her disposal. They watched as she lost her grip on her identity, her mind becoming as clear and cold as the glass in her veins. She was no longer a person who ruled. She was a frequency that was being managed by a committee. The Virgin Queen had become the ghost in the Whitehall machine, a rhythmic shadow in a palace of lead. Perhaps the most visceral evidence of Elizabeth's psychological collapse was the incident of the Black Diamond. In late 1602, the artificers were performing a routine maintenance on the shell's porcelain mask. When they removed the eye sockets to clean the glass lenses, they found a small, dark object wedged in the seam of the jaw. It was a single petrified tear. The informative depth of this discovery is chilling. Because the real Queen often stood near the shell in the darkness, she had apparently wept while leaning against the machine. But because of the alchemical tinctures she was consuming, her tears were no longer water. They were a concentrated solution of carbon and mineral salts. As the tear hit the cold porcelain, it had crystallized instantly into a black diamond. This was the Queen's last act of rebellion, a physical manifestation of her sorrow that the artificers had to literally chisel away. The psychological layer here is the realization that her emotions were becoming as inorganic as her body. Even her grief was being mineralized. She could no longer feel the wetness of sorrow. She felt only the hardness of it. She was a woman whose internal world was turning to stone. One tear at a time, the moral decay of the state was their reaction to the diamond. They did not see it as a sign of the Queen's agony. They saw it as a new resource. They took the black diamond and set it into a ring for Robert Cecil. Claiming it was a gift from the celestial Queen, they weaponized her suffering, turning her literal tears into symbols of their own authority. Elizabeth watched as they wore her grief on their fingers, and in that moment, the last of her human warmth extinguished. The sensory cues of this period were ones of extreme cold and static. The air in the Queen's room was so charged that sparks would fly whenever she touched the velvet hangings. She began to speak of the transparent kingdom, a place where everyone was made of glass and no one could tell a lie. She was no longer living in England. She was living in a psychological landscape of her own making, a world where the only reality was the reflection of the light off the porcelain mask. The archive chill is the feeling of that cold diamond tear, a reminder that the cost of an eternal image is the total petrification of the human heart as we reach the final months of the reign. The pacing of Elizabeth's psychology slows to a near halt. She reached a state of static consciousness, where her mind no longer processed the passage of days. She sat in her ebony chair, her unblinking eyes fixed on a single point on the lead-lined wall. She had become a part of the architecture of the palace, a biological anchor that was no longer conscious of the weight it was holding. The informative reality of the Tudor secret is that the monarchy had outgrown the monarch. The state had created a system that no longer required a living person to function. The shell was the true sovereign, and Elizabeth was merely the ghostly prototype. The moral decay was the birth of the modern institutional soul, a soul that is cold, static, and devoid of human empathy. The advisors had succeeded in their goal. They had created a power that could never be interrupted by a human heart. The psychological layer for our Tier 1 audience is the question of what remains when the self is stripped away. Elizabeth was no longer a woman, a sister, or a friend. She was a frequency. She was a vibration in the marrow of the British Empire. She had been refined until there was nothing left but the diamond core. The archive chill is the realization that this is the final destination of the Tudor line. The Golden Age ended not with a bang, but with a mechanical click and a long, cold silence. Think of the Queen sitting in the dark, her glass bones humming, her mind a clear, empty room. She was the first human to be fully processed by the machinery of the state. A woman who became a mask to save an empire. As the light of the 17th century begins to dim, imagine the sound of the ticking shell echoing through the palace. It is the only sound that remains. The Queen is a statue. The statue is a queen. The boundary between the two has vanished. The history you have been told is a dream. The truth is much colder and much clearer. The woman was gone, and only the frequency remained. She had lost her humanity, and in doing so, she had become the ultimate icon, a monarch of the void, eternal and empty. But as the final days of 1602 came to an end, the artificers noticed that the real Elizabeth's skin was no longer just translucent. It was beginning to emit a low, rhythmic pulse of light that matched the movements of the planets. To understand the final, terrifying stage of the Tudor petrification, we must look at the final coronation, the secret, burial of the porcelain remains, and the truth about what was left in the casket when the world said goodbye. The grand funeral of Queen Elizabeth. The first in 1603 was the final and most elaborate betrayal of the English people. While thousands wept in the streets of London as the black-draped coffin passed, they were mourning a hollow lie. The forbidden records of the Westminster Deanery reveal a shocking conspiracy. The lead-lined casket destined for the royal vault was not filled with the body of a queen, but with bags of Thames sand and the shattered remains of a mechanical shell. The biological Elizabeth, the woman who had turned into a crystalline anomaly of glass and mercury, was never placed beneath the marble effigy. To prevent a catastrophic religious uprising and to hide the evidence of a failed alchemical curse, the state buried the truth of her physical dissolution in a secret, unmarked location. They left the Abbey empty, a silent void at the heart of the British Empire. This was the ultimate moral decay of a dynasty that chose to preserve an icon while discarding the person. The Tudor legacy did not end with a royal death, but with a calculated erasure. They entombed a ghost to protect a secret that was too dangerous for the living. The history of the 17th century was built upon this hollow foundation, a silence so deep it still vibrates in the stones of the vault. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We step out of the candlelit palace and into the cold, cavernous shadows of Westminster Abbey. Here, the air is still and carries the scent of damp stone and ancient incense. Settle into the rhythmic silence of the final hour, and prepare to face the void. The night of March 24, 1603, was not a night of mourning inside the walls of Richmond Palace. It was a night of industrial disposal. To the Tier 1 audience seeking the technical reality of the Tudor end, we must look at the final correction. As the human Elizabeth finally reached the point of total crystallization, her heart of diamond stopping its rhythmic hum, the advisors moved with a clinical speed that defied the gravity of the moment. They did not call for the clergy, which had stood in for the Queen during the final year of her reign, was dismantled with a high-pitched metallic screech. The silver wires were cut, the porcelain mask was shattered into a fine dust, and the internal gears were melted down in a portable furnace brought into the bedchamber. This was the first stage of the erasure. Every piece of evidence that a machine had ruled England had to be destroyed before the sun rose. The moral decay was the total lack of ceremony. There were no prayers said over the clockwork joints, only the sound of heavy hammers and the smell of hot iron simultaneously. The real Elizabeth, a figure of clear, shimmering glass, bone, and translucent skin, was being prepared for her secret transit. Because her body was now a biological hazard, saturated with mercury and lead, she could not be traditionally embalmed. The alchemical reaction within her marrow was still active, causing her body to emit a soft, blue glow even in death. The advisors realized that if she were placed in the Abbey, the frequency of her petrification would eventually cause the marble tomb to crack, revealing the crystalline horror within. Thus, a second casket was prepared. This one was made of solid, triple-layered lead, designed to act as a permanent radiation shield. Elizabeth was placed inside this saturnine container, her hands folded over her translucent chest. There was no velvet shroud, only a lining of ground obsidian to absorb her light. This casket was not taken to the Abbey. It was moved through the secret water gate of the palace. and taken downriver to an undisclosed location, a place where the tide would forever mask the sound of her internal hum. The casket that the public saw, the one that would lie in state at Whitehall, was a decoy. It was a heavy, leaden box filled with sand to simulate the weight of a body. The Tudor legacy was already a hollow thing before it ever reached the vault. As we move into the weeks following the funeral, the informative depth of the cover-up becomes evident in the construction of the royal tomb in Westminster Abbey. James I, the new king, was fully briefed on the porcelain secret. His first act was to ensure that the monument built for Elizabeth was structurally different from any other royal tomb. He commissioned a massive, elevated marble structure that was essentially a sealed stone room, rather than a traditional grave. The sensory cues of the tomb are haunting. If you stand near the monument today, you will notice a specific archive chill that persists even in the heat of summer. This is not due to the lack of sun, but to the specific materials used in the base of the tomb. James ordered a thick layer of charcoal and quicklime to be placed beneath the marble floor. To the public, this was for preservation. To the initiated, it was a chemical barrier. They were neutralizing the ghost of the secret. The informative reality is that the tomb was designed to never be opened. While other royal caskets were often moved or inspected during subsequent centuries, Elizabeth's vault was sealed with iron clamps and molten lead. The psychological layer for King James was one of extreme paranoia. He was a man obsessed with witchcraft and the occult, and he viewed Elizabeth's transformation as a demonic curse that could infect his own line. He wanted the Tudor secret buried so deep that it would be forgotten by time itself. He authorized the Great Erasure, a systematic burning of the royal apothecary logs, and the secret diaries of the silent maids. Any artificer who had worked on the shell was pensioned off to remote colonies or simply vanished from the records. The state created a vacuum of information, replacing the messy, biological truth of the Porcelain Queen with a clean, heroic myth. They built the marble effigy to show a woman of eternal, static grace, a figure of white stone that would mirror the porcelain mask they had forced her to wear. The Abbey became a gallery of silence, a place where the people could worship a symbol while the truth drifted in the mud of the Thames. The moral decay had successfully moved from the palace to the temple, as the church itself became a co-conspirator in the lie of the empty casket. What happens to a nation when its anchor is a void? The psychological layer of the early 17th century was one of deep, unspoken unease. Even though the public believed the Queen was safely entombed, a spectral anxiety began to permeate the English soul. People reported hearing the ticking of the state in the quiet hours of the night, a rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The informative detail of this period is found in the sudden rise of melancholic poetry and the obsession with the vanitas, the image of the skull beneath the skin. The Tier 1 audience understands that this was a collective subconscious reaction to the hidden truth. The people knew on some level that the Virgin Queen had not left them in the natural way. They sensed the archive chill that had settled over the government. James I tried to combat this by elevating Elizabeth to a state of secular sainthood. He encouraged the cult of Gloriana, ensuring that her portraits were always youthful and her virtues always praised. But the moral decay was the hypocrisy of this worship. James was spending the royal treasury on his own favorites while the people looked back at the Elizabethan era as a lost paradise. They were worshipping a porcelain shell, a static image that had been designed by a committee of advisors. The retention of the secret required a constant state of historical engineering. The forbidden knowledge was that the monarchy was no longer a human institution. By replacing Elizabeth with a shell and burying an empty casket, the state had learned that they didn't need a real person to rule. They only needed a consensus. They only needed the appearance of continuity. This is the birth of the modern bureaucratic soul, a soul that is cold, archival, and utterly silent. Mary Radcliffe, the maid of honor whose diary we explored, wrote in her final, dying entry that the silence of the Abbey was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She realized that the Tudor legacy ended not with the death of a queen, but with the birth of a machine. The emptiness of the tomb was a metaphor for the emptiness of the power that remained. The state had become a curator of a void, and the people were its unwitting audience. As you drift into the shadows of the night, think of the marble effigy in the Abbey, its cold, stone eyes looking out at a world that is still trying to hear the sound of a human heart within the silence. As the years of the 17th century turned into decades, the Stuart kings maintained the Porcelain Mandate with a ruthless efficiency. The informative reality of the year 1625 shows that when King James himself was dying, he left a saturnine instruction for his son, Charles I. This instruction, written in a ciphered hand, warned the new king never to allow a physician to touch the Queen's tomb in Westminster. It spoke of the crystalline residue that still lingered in the air of the vault and the danger of the Tudor frequency. The moral decay of the Stuart line was their use of Elizabeth's secret to justify their own divine right. They argued that if the monarch could be physically transformed by the power of the throne, then they were truly a different species from their subjects. They took the forbidden knowledge of the alchemical curse and turned it into a political weapon. They looked at the empty abbey as proof of their own spiritual superiority. However, the archive chill could not be entirely contained. During the English Civil War, when the authority of the crown was challenged, rumors of the hollow queen began to circulate among the parliamentarian soldiers. They spoke of the clockwork tyrant and the glass idol. They sensed that the monarchy they were fighting was not a human one, but a static, mechanical system that had been frozen in time since 1603. The psychological layer for the Tier 1 audience is the realization that the war was not just about politics, but about the reclamation of the human soul from the machine of the state. The execution of Charles I was a desperate attempt to break the porcelain illusion, to see if a king would bleed red blood or liquid light. But the secret held. The Artificers Guild, though diminished, still operated in the shadows, ensuring that the alchemical records remained buried. Even when the monarchy was restored, the silence remained. The empty tomb was never opened. The marble effigy continued to stare at the ceiling of the Abbey, a monument to a woman who had vanished into the shadows of the Thames. The Tudor legacy had become a black hole in English history, a point where the light of the truth was bent and swallowed by the gravity of the secret. The informative reality of our own time is that we are still living in the wake of this erasure. We still worship the image of Elizabeth, the Golden Queen, while ignoring the cold, lead-lined void that she left behind. The silence of the Abbey is the ultimate victory of the state over the individual. A victory that was bought with the sight of the maids, the sanity of the Queen, and the truth of a nation. We have reached the end of our journey through the Porcelain Mandate. We have walked through the lead-lined chambers, looked into the black obsidian mirror and heard the crystalline snap of a breaking face. We have seen the moral decay of a court that traded a woman's life for a static icon. And we have felt the archive chill of a history that has been carefully erased, the story of Queen Elizabeth I is the ultimate cautionary tale of the nature of power. It tells us that power is a transformative substance, an alchemical fire that consumes the flesh and leaves behind only a cold, hard shell. The forbidden knowledge we have uncovered is the realization that the Golden Age was built on a foundation of porcelain and poison. The stability of the empire was maintained by a machine, while the woman who birthed it was buried in the mud of the river, her glass bones still humming in the dark, the informative reality for you. As you drift now into the deepest part of the night, is the understanding that every legacy is a curated silence. We are told the stories that the state wants us to hear, and we are shown the monuments that the state wants us to see. But the truth is always there, in the empty abbey, waiting for those who are willing to listen to the vibration of the stones. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, the porcelain monarch, remains the most lonely figure in our history. She was a woman who was forced to become a goddess, only to find that a goddess has no heart. She was a monarch of the void, a frequency trapped in a marble cage as the candles of the 16th century finally flicker out. Imagine the sound of the River Thames, flowing silently past the unmarked grave of the real queen. The water moves over the lead casket, cooling the alchemical heat of her crystalline blood. She is finally free of the mask, free of the ruff, and free of the eyes of the court. The silence is no longer a betrayal. It is a mercy. The Tudor story has reached its final, absolute end. The archive is closed. The secret is safe. The light has faded into the dark, and the glass has turned to dust. Sleep now.